So it will, in a minute, tell us how many people are watching.
Okay.
And it will tell you in the top corner how long it's live for.
Okay.
But yeah, so I'll just start by saying hello to anybody that is watching. It sometimes is a bit slow to update, so it will suddenly go, oh, people are watching. But it does usually take a few moments for everyone to kind of get on board and settle into it, I suppose. So
yeah,
we'll just wait. We'll just have to wait a few minutes. This is when when I'm on my own. This is always
the weird
bit. You sort of sit there like just waiting for everyone. But yeah. So hello everybody that's just tuned in. It's just popped up and said there's about 18 people watching suddenly. So
oh my god.
hello everybody. Hope everybody is well. Hope you're all doing okay and managing to keep dry on this very gloomy day. It was all right earlier, but it's suddenly been raining all afternoon. And I hope you're all excited for this evening as well. We've got a really cracking lineup tonight. As you can see on screen, we've got Steph with us, and she's going to help talk us through the whiskies. We've got some really good stuff coming up. If you have any questions, please do put them in the comment box. If you don't want to do that, I've got the email as well, so you can always drop us an email and you can put any questions forward as well. But yeah, we're just going to wait a couple of minutes just to make sure everybody's online and settled in, and then we will get started with it all as well, which should be nice. So yeah.
I need to warn everyone, this is my first one. So.
Yeah, it's quite, it takes a bit of getting used to. It's taken me a bit of getting used to, but I think people enjoy it anyway.
I've gone red already. I think the good thing when I do a tasting is I can't see myself talk, and it's all right. Whereas now, oh goodness, oh well.
I try not to look too much at myself on the screen, because then I just end up going off track a little bit. But yeah, it is looking more likely that we won't be doing any we won't be doing any physical tastings this side of Christmas. But we have released like a full lineup of tastings. There's a couple of dates that we need to get confirmed, but they got sent out on the newsletter, which should be on there. So yeah, we're going to be doing virtual ones probably until next year. It looks like. Then we'll assess and see how things are next year. Hopefully, then we'll be able to get everybody in here in our new shop.
Extra big celebration then.
Yes, yeah.
Are there anything you're particularly looking forward to?
Tasting wise, we've got Filey Bay coming up on the
amazing.
1st of October.
I visited like last week.
Yeah, I think Jed's been meaning to get up there, but he's just never got around to going up there. But we've got some of their stuff on. Yeah, that's at the beginning of October. I was going to say September, but that's not right. Beginning of October. And then we're going to do a Beaujolais Nouveau tasting as well. That's going to be fun. Because apparently the date's still the same for the release this year. They've not changed it, which is good, but they're releasing it. They're sending it out like a week early, so you'll have a little bit of extra time to sort of sit.
Will you send out wine for that? How are you going to do that?
We've got little bottles. If we can pour them sort of the couple of days before, then they should be okay for tasting. I
want to do that.
So it should be it should be good. It should be good fun for that.
Our tour at Filey Bay was amazing.
Was it?
Really, really good. I was just driving up to Scotland a week and a half ago, and decided we didn't want to do all the drive in a one-er. So I contacted Joe, one of the guys there, and sorted out a tour. And delicious. Yeah,
the whiskies are really good. So yeah, that'll be really exciting. And then what else have we got? We've got some good, exciting tastings planned. We'll just say that you may have been sent an email out saying that we are closed as a shop. Apologies for that. So our stock system and our mailing system linked up together sent everyone an email out saying that we were closed when we're not. In fact, our Shireville shop is open. So you might have got another email and apologising. So apologies if there's been a bombardment of emails of that sense. But yeah, we are open. With the new shop I'm in here at the moment, I spent the past couple of days up here, so we're getting it all tidied, restocked, stock counted. things like that. And we're hoping to have this open for the very end of September, beginning of October. So that'll be good as well, because I know a lot of people have been asking, when's it back open again? So yeah, all good positive things coming, some exciting things. But yeah, so I think we've got about 20 people watching us, but it keeps going up and down, so I'm not sure if someone's having a slight issue with
Wobble.
it. Yeah. So should we get started?
I think that sounds good. Just as an FYI for people, I will be going through the whiskies that we're tasting in a specific order. If you've cracked into one already, then fine. But they do come, they get kind of more intense as we go further through the tasting, so it does make sense. So I'll tell you, and the beginning bit is a bit long because it's an introduction, but I'll give you a hint when to drink, if that's all right.
Yeah, of course.
I can't see them. They could be doing anything. They've probably chinned them all by now.
You never know. Steph, if you could just do a quick introduction about yourself and who you are, etc., just to kind of introduce yourself to everyone. Sure. So I know some people will be probably familiar if you've been to some of the tastings at the Blake before, but I know there's a couple of people that probably might not be. So, and just for anybody that kind of rewatches it later. So yeah.
No worries. So my name's Steph. I am one of the whiskey ambassadors and the head of education for a company called Specialty Brands. We import and distribute sort of top-end luxury spirits from around the world, and I get to look after all the whiskies. So Nikka is one of our brands, and I've been working pretty much in the company since we took on Nikka. That's when I started, was to help look after Nikka. So it's about 5.5 years we've had it now.
Nice.
Yeah. And before that, I was a rum ambassador, and before that, I was a cocktail bartender. So, yeah.
We've got quite a lot of stuff from Speciality. And you always do fun things. I was really lucky. I got to go to Cocky in September last year.
Amazing.
That was great fun.
So beautiful. So delicious.
It was, yeah. But yeah, we've got some really nice stuff from you guys. Yeah.
The last tasting I did with you guys actually was with Gabby. We did smoke, so whiskey versus mezcal.
Yeah, that would have
might have been to. So that was a fun one. Right, shall we commence?
Yes.
Okay. Cool. So we're going to take a little journey to the land of the rising sun, to Japan, I think a lot of people have been super excited about Japanese whiskey in the last few years. Obviously, it's been coming into the country quite a lot for quite a while. I mean, I think the last 5 to 10 years, it's really ramped up. But before that, whiskey geeks, people in the whiskey industry all quite enjoyed it, but it didn't really start hitting kind of the consumers' kind of minds until about sort of 10, 12 years ago. So there's actually quite a long history to it, which I'm going to try and get through quite a lot of, like I say, about the long start before drams. And the history of Nikka is the history of Japanese whiskey. So it all ties together brilliantly. Okay, so we're going to start off with a guy called Masataka Taketsuru. He's known as the father of Japanese whiskey. And he was born in the late 1800s. His family had been making sake since the 1730s. So from a young age, he knew how to make booze, how to taste it, how to get different flavors from different production methods. So, is quite a young age. His dad had actually earmarked him as the son that he wanted to take over the family business because he had such a good palate. But it was a bit controversial because he was the third son in the family. So not the one you'd usually hand your business down to. But unfortunately for his dad, he was not that interested in sake because about 40 years before he was born, foreign booze started coming into Japan. Now, I'm not sure if anyone's aware, but Japan kept itself really closed off from trade with the rest of the world, particularly Europe, up until the kind of 1850s. They'd seen what had happened in the rest of Asia and quite a lot of the rest of the world, which is, Europeans coming in, doing some trade, pretending to be nice, and accidentally taking over your country. And the Japanese were not up for that.
Yeah.
As you can imagine.
Yeah.
So they decided that trade was the kind of start of this. It was exactly our tactic. And it wasn't just the British for a change, actually. The French and the Dutch and the Portuguese and the Spanish and everyone was in on it.
It's around the time that it was kind of like we had like the empire and things, isn't it? And we were
for about like 300-400 years we were like all, you know, Europeans were all competing about like landing on a bit of land and trying to claim it, whether people lived there before or not, and obviously more often than not they did. And so Japanese had learned from what, you know, they tried to happen in China and then lots of other countries around Asia, that letting in the Europeans and they were nice and accepting their gifts might not be a great idea. So they'd like I say, been really controlling trade. So the only thing that Japanese people drank really was their own made alcohol. So sake, I'm sure maybe some of you have tried. It's you can describe it simply as rice wine, although it is one of the most complicated categories ever. If they wanted to get a bit more boozy, they drank something called soju, and soju is their distilled spirit, and it's made from a variety of different things. Rice is one option, but there's some potato, there's some barley. There's all kinds of options depending which bit of Japan you live in. And so that's what everyone had been drinking because nothing else was imported. And in the 1850s, the Europeans had got a little bit less likely to take over foreign countries. And so Japan thought it was a bit safer idea to open up to trade. And so foreign things started coming in, and the Japanese people were obviously super excited. If you could afford or get a hold of anything European made or American made, then you were much cooler than all your friends. But of course, it was very expensive. It came in by boats, tiny quantities. So if you knew someone who knew someone who knew someone who tried some European alcohol, probably, you know, or wine or whiskey, but whiskey traveled better, then you were way cooler than all your friends. But it was mainly the very, very upper classes. So Taketsuru got super interested in this foreign booze when he was a young man and started working for Japan's biggest alcohol import company, so only dealing with the foreign stuff. And obviously left the family business, which was a bit difficult at the time. And then that company wanted to build Japan's first proper whiskey distillery. Now, just to be clear, people had been making whiskey before this. And the thing was that I think, you know, you see a huge demand for a product that's not much supply of. So you try and fake it. And quite a lot of the Japanese shochu distilleries started making things that they thought were similar to whiskey, making a similar flavor, maybe coloring it with a bit of brown stuff, putting whiskey on the bottle. So there was a few, you know, wood chips, all kinds of stuff. There was a few sort of fake Japanese whiskies that Japanese people knew weren't real, but they were still cooler than drinking sake or something. So that was. I mean,
you do see that. You sort of see that today a little bit as well with some. I mean, there are some Japanese whiskies out there that the stock is actually Scottish whiskey that's been taken over to
Japan. And actually quite commonly Canadian as well, because the Scotch has still got a huge cachet. So even if you've got what I'm going to call hideous Scotch whiskey, which of course there isn't very much of, in Japan you still make quite a lot of money from that. So they're quite often using from other unidentified sources, which have the reputation in Japan. So the trend for whiskey was huge. They could only import a tiny bit. It was super expensive. So they started trying to make it and they didn't know how it was made. So of course they just did whatever and they were like, well, our stuff's clear, their stuff's brown. I bet it's basically the same. So those are the early Japanese whiskies. And Taketsuru's company that he was working for wanted to build the first, what I'm going to call proper whiskey distillery in Japan. So they sent him to Scotland in 1918 so that he could learn from the first, from, you know, people how it was made. Now this picture is actually one of my favorite pictures. It's shown at one of Nikka's distilleries as part of the kind of heritage bit as the museum. But it has actually the caption there in the museum of Taketsuru arrives in Scotland. And I'm sure people recognize that's Big Ben. He's written London on the pictures, so they kind of get away with it. But I love that bit. So he arrived in Scotland in 1918. He actually enrolled in Glasgow Uni. And he studied kind of food science and chemistry. He'd already studied it in Japan, but now studying in English and actually Scottish is even harder probably. So he was doing that. And it was like nowadays, the easiest way to get a visa. Like if he'd have come across trying to get a job at a distillery would have been super hard, but to get a student visa was the way. So he enrolled in Glasgow Uni And you can see that it's sort of top left there on the screen. I wish it makes the same way around for me looking at it.
Yes.
Good, thanks. And started studying there. And while he was doing that, he also started writing to distilleries to see if he could get some work experience. I just imagine these kind of baffled Scottish guys working at the distillery receiving these letters from a Japanese guy. Like, must have been like, this is a joke. This can't be. So
thinking like, where did this come from?
Yeah, this must be nonsense. Anyway, the first place he managed to get a bit of kind of expertise and a bit of time to work at was Longmorn, so top right in the diagram, up in Speyside. And here he learned the basics, obviously, like barley, malting barley, all the fermentation distillation techniques. Making booze in Japan is done quite differently, particularly the kind of getting alcohol made from fermentable sugars. So it would have been quite a lot for him to get to grips with, and also aging as well. So he learned quite a lot there. Then the next one he moved to was Bowness Distillery, so bottom right on that map. Now that's between kind of just outside of Edinburgh. You might not have heard of that as a famous distillery. It actually used to make grain whiskey, and it closed in the 30s. So you're not going to find any old vintage single malts from there, because it was all chucked into blends. But they were quite famous for using coffee stills, which will come into play in a little bit. Then he left working there and he started working at the one at the bottom left, Hazelburn Distillery over in Campbelltown. And obviously Hazelburn now is made at Springbank, but it was a separate distillery in those days. And here he learned, obviously, again, making single malts. Differently from Longmorn, though, of course, there's a lot more kind of peat used, the coastal techniques, different shapes of stills, and just, the little things that differ from distillery to distillery. So he was picking that up. Also, we've got to remember at this time is Glasgow is the sort of centre of whiskey blending. So he was learning that at the same time. So he was quite busy. Studying at uni, working at these different distilleries, and courting. So this lovely lady here, she's called Rita, and she was the elder sister of one of his classmates at university. He'd been invited around to the family home, technically to meet the younger brother, apparently, of his classmates, who was being bullied at school, and he was going to teach him jiu-jitsu, which is cool. Yeah, right. But I think he was just invited around because he was the first Japanese person to study in Scotland.
Yeah.
I think everyone was just like, come to my house because you must meet my family. So him and Rita got on very well. He actually ended up moving in with the family as a lodger. Her dad had died a couple of years before. He was a doctor. They were really missing the money. Quite a big house in Kirkintilloch, just outside Glasgow. So they needed a bit of extra money coming in. So having a nice student lodger come and stay was a good idea. And they got on very well and they married. Neither family, I think, was delighted at the time. Obviously, interracial marriage in Scotland in those days was pretty usual. It was even rarer in Japan. So, neither families were very keen initially, but I think, everyone saw how happy they were. And, grew accustomed to. 1920, and late 1920, Taketsuru takes his new wife back to Japan, and obviously the plan is still to build a whiskey distillery. This is a long journey. It's 3 months by boat, and actually got to think of Rita at this point as well. She's moving away from her family, everything she's ever known, and even to write a letter home at that stage, it would have taken months to get to Scotland, and even if someone replies that day, another 3 months to get back.
That's
mad, isn't it?
Mad. And of course,
doing a virtual tasting,
and of course as well, she's moving to the other side of the world, and at that time, I suppose stories of other places like that people only ever heard about through letters and through kind of people that had been there and the stories that they had to tell about it.
Absolutely.
I mean, nowadays, like obviously we're doing virtual tasting here, but we can connect with people all over the world, and so I can imagine it would have been incredibly exciting, but she would have been incredibly nervous as well about it.
I know. But I just think, my sister lives in New Zealand, but I can ask her a question and get an answer pretty quickly. Imagine asking a question and get an answer 6 months later.
So how are you?
I know.
Well.
Yeah. Well, and also I think quite often letters would overlap. So you'd be writing a letter every week to your sister, for example.
Yeah.
Write a letter every week back to you, but you'd be like talking at cross purposes. It'd be really confusing. Anyway, so that was kind of interesting. So Taketsuru, this is a stage when most people sort of start talking about the history of Japanese whiskey. So Taketsuru went back to his company, and obviously they planned for him to build this whiskey distillery. But obviously there's been a recession after the First World War, and he arrives back in Japan in 1920. So not a great time. And the company that he was working for decided that they didn't really have enough money to build a whiskey distillery. I'm not sure if anyone at home has ever thought about it, but building a whiskey distillery is one of the worst business decisions you can make ever. Not only you've got a lot of expensive stuff to buy, it takes a long time before you've got anything you can sell. So they were like, we'll carry on our import job. You can have your old job back, importing and selling stuff. But if you want to do the whiskey distillery project, then we're out. And so he left, and he started looking for someone else who would be able to work with him on this project. And like I say, this is the point that most people start the history of Japanese whiskey. But when I used to hear this, I'd be like, but why and how? And all those other questions. So hopefully what I've just told you helps set the scene a little bit. So Taketsuru met a guy who actually they knew. It's an old family friend, a guy called Shinjiro Tori. So it's the guy on the left on this screen. And he is the guy who set up the Suntory Whiskey Company. Now he is one of the guys who had been making the kind of whiskey before Taketsuru. He hadn't really done very well with that, but what he had done, and he'd been kind of in chemistry and I think perfume and a few different things beforehand. But he had made a huge fortune making another kind of European or fake European thing, and he called it port wine, Academy port wine. And it was neither port nor wine. It was just kind of locally made, coloured and flavoured to look like a European thing. And again, in a recession, everyone to be seen drinking foreign things. Yes. But they can't afford actual foreign things. And the way to make a ton of money is to make a fake foreign thing locally. So that's what he'd done. Huge success. And so he'd actually been advertising in Scotland for a distillery manager to move over and build him Japan's first whiskey distillery. But I think, again, those guys in Scotland getting these letters or seeing this advert would be like, no. What's going on? Just had a Japanese guy write to us and now the papers. What's happening? So no applications, weirdly enough. But then he heard that Taketsuru, who's from a well-respected alcohol-making family from Japan, is just back after 2 years of working in whiskey distilleries. So he employed him on a 10-year contract to design and build and run Japan's first, like I was saying, proper whiskey distillery. And like I say, some of the other distilleries, the stuff that they were making, some of it had been really far away from what whiskey is. And some of them, some soju is made from barley, so it might not have been too distant from what whiskey actually is. But it was the first person to learn from a whiskey making country. So they started working together. And it was a bit difficult, actually. I mean, obviously, at the beginning, they've both got the same aims. This is all great. But then they start arguing almost immediately, unfortunately. They both got quite strong ideas about what they want to do. And Taketsuru, because he's been in Scotland, he wants to make things very much in the Scottish style, whereas Shinjiro Tori knows what the Japanese palate and the Japanese community wants, which is very different from the Scotch at the time, which was a bit quite smoky, quite punchy, really designed for warming you up on a cold day. Japan is quite a bit warmer usually, so more kind of elegant palate, so with big love for fruity flavors as well. So they start arguing almost immediately, and the kind of interesting thing is the first thing they argue about is where to put this distillery, and this map is just a little bit of a demonstration, because I think a lot of people don't realize how big Japan is. So that's in blue. Obviously it's not in the right place, but that is it kind of to scale over Europe. And when I'm a bit of an idiot geographically, I look at a map of an island country and I assume it's the same size as Britain, because of course it's an island. And that's not how it works out. Australia also not the same size as Britain.
Australia is
many other islands not the same size as Britain. So if you kind of move that map around a wee bit in your head, if you look at kind of the middle of Scotland and you put the north of Japan in the middle of Scotland, then you'll sort of see that the sort of bottom bit of Japan would be in southern France or northern Spain. And so one of the big things that Taketsuru and Shinjiro Tori argued about was where to put this distillery. Taketsuru is like, the climate, we have to go to the north of Japan. I know from being there how important the climate of Scotland and the water of Scotland is to making whiskey. And I think obviously quite a lot of us know this now, from studying whiskey. Whereas Shinjiro Tori hadn't been to Scotland at that stage, but he was also kind of a bit more of the commercial guy. He realized that not many people lived in the north of Japan, and to position the distillery quite near one of Japan's biggest cities or most populated areas, because if you're making booze, one of the most expensive bits of it to sort out your selling price is transport.
Yeah, of course.
And the less distance you have to transport it, the cheaper it can be. And again, still post-recession, Japan keeping the cost down was important. So he wanted to build a distillery further south. And they argued about this a lot. And Taketsuru, they did eventually compromise. They actually, I think the next slide, sorry, I just pressed next on my thing. So where Taketsuru, that star, I'm not sure if everyone can see at the top, is Taketsuru's preference. That's where Taketsuru wanted to set up his distillery, anywhere in the island of Hokkaido. And what they actually settled on was further down that southern star there. It's in a valley, it's up in some hills, so there's a bit of altitude, but that would be the equivalent of very southern France, straight northern Spain.
Yeah, I was going to say, because on that last slide with the map, you can see the sort of difference in the size of it, and when you think about the difference in climate from kind of the top of Japan where it was, that was in like the kind of Norway area, right down to the very southern parts of Spain, and it gets
there's more islands. Yeah. I mean, and that we've chopped off those islands at the bottom just to make it fit on as well, rudely. Yeah. Lots of people live there; they're beautiful. So that was a big argument, and I think obviously it's going to make a big impact in the flavour of the whiskey. And things, but like I say, they did find this valley up in some hills, so there's a little bit of altitude, brought the temperature down a wee bit. And the valley that it was Yamazaki Valley, so I'm sure you've all heard of the distillery that's built there, and they started building that in 1932. So that was all lovely. So that's the kind of 1923. Got my dates. So that is the beginning, kind of like I say, of a whiskey distillery that's designed just for whiskey, with people who have been to other whiskey making countries and potentially have insight on how to make it. The first one in Japan. So very, very exciting. So they worked together for a little while. And actually, this is all kind of featured. I'm not sure if anyone's up for a really cheesy Japanese soap opera. But this is Masan that was shown in Japan a few years ago. And it was actually based on Taketsuru and Rita's life together. So his friend Taka and his surname is Taketsuru. Her name was Rita, and you can see on this they've called him Masan and her Ellie. Japanese TV is state TV, so they're not allowed to look like they're promoting a specific company. So they renamed the people and the company, but the story is essentially the same. And actually, Taketsuru and Rita went through so much stuff trying to get this distillery set up that, usually soap operas will have to maybe invent some trauma for everyone to go through. They did not have to do that here. So it's a huge thing. And it happened just at the same time as a bunch of Japanese whiskies on a bunch of awards. And that created the huge demand that we saw in those few years. That then there's been so many discontinuations and shortages of supply since then. So this is all to do with it. So what was I saying? Oh yes. So they worked together for 10 years, Taketsuru and Shinjiro Tori. Obviously that contract they'd signed, like I say, they didn't really get on that brilliantly. Taketsuru did manage to get Shinjiro Tori and his son over to Scotland a couple of times in that time. It was good. I think he was obviously trying to show them like, no, I said that I meant this. And, the sort of plans continued. They had a big argument about the first whiskey they released, and Taketsuru had lost the argument about where to build the distillery, but he won the argument about the first whiskey to release, and he wanted it to be smoky and punchy and Scottish style tasting, and it was a massive flop. And then Shinjiro, no, it needs to be smoother and fruitier and more elegant, and so they just didn't get on. And so Taketsuru, the whole time they were working together, was saving up, because he realized that the only way for him to be able to get control of the type of whiskey he made was to set up his own distillery. So he was saving up, and in the next section, after 10 years, Taketsuru in 1934 with Rita moved up to the north of Japan, that northern island that we just saw a minute ago where that star was. he found a little plot of land just next to the sea. You can see where the river meets the sea. So this river here is the Yoichi River. The blue bit at the top is the sea on the left of Japan. And that little, it's a town that was like a fishing village at the time, is called Yoichi. And then see those red roofed buildings sort of towards the middle at the bottom? That's the distillery there. And so they started building this distillery in 1934. Obviously, it was everything that Taketsuru wanted. It was coastal. It was very traditional. It was in the middle of nowhere. Like, there was not many people up in that island in those days. And so this was him sort of being able to do things he wanted to do. Even though he'd been saving for 10 years, though, he hadn't really got enough money to just build a whiskey distillery and not do anything else. So what they started up was actually a fruit juice company. So they started making apple juice, pear juice, plum juice, all these things. Lots and lots of orchards up in that area of Japan, and selling the fruit juice, and then slowly saving up to buy different bits of the distillery. So they got their fermentation tanks. They started making cider as well. And then once the stills came, that's when they started being able to make whiskey. So they started building the distillery in 1934, started distilling in 1936, and released their first whiskey in 1940. So that's kind of the beginning of Nikka.
I knew a little bit about some of that, but not all of the details. I didn't realize they'd started making juice first to kind of fund it. And when you're sort of saying about setting up a distillery, a whiskey distillery, it is an expensive thing. You will often see that there's certain distilleries, places like Cotswolds, for example, their main aim was to set up as a whiskey distillery. But a lot of people know them because of their gin, because by law in the UK, you have to leave it for 3 years. And I'm assuming that when Taketsuru set up, he wanted to abide by the Scottish sort of laws in that sense. And a lot of people, like I said, a lot of people will know places like Cotswolds for their gin, because that's what they were doing in the meantime to kind of fund their whiskey whilst it was resting and whilst it was waiting to be released. So yeah, I can see that whiskey, unlike gin, where it can be quite a kind of quick, the industry is quite young, and it's sort of, this gin boom is quite young, and it's quite kind of fresh, and you can set up a new distillery relatively quickly. With whiskey, it's sort of the complete opposite, really. It's a very lengthy process.
Really, really lengthy. And obviously, if you set up in Scotland, you've maybe got access to people who can make you a mill, or people who can make you the stills and stuff. Over in Japan, it wasn't either. So you're like, he's got notebooks from when he was in Scotland, and the detail of the notes and the drawings, the diagrams are amazing. So he's planning to go back and show this to a copper worker. Like, you need to make this shape thing for me, please.
And you build it like
it's going to be this big, and exactly. So super, super difficult. So I mean, obviously that distillery looks quite big there, but it took time to build on different bits on, and quite slowly. And Taketsuru and Rita lived on site, and their house is still there. It's like a kind of museum thing you can go into when you visit. Still got some of their clothes and stuff in it. It's absolutely amazing. Some things, and their piano was the piano was very important. So this is the start of Nikka. Now, obviously, 1940, I'm going to say not a great time to launch a product. And that's basically what happened to Nikka. So to them, these guys. So obviously, there was lots of food shortages around the world because of the Second World War. And Japan was no different. And again, like Britain, island countries, quite often lots of shipping happening to bring in new food supplies or move them around. And so their government did the same as ours and imposed rationing. And so they were using barley, which could be used to make food, to make whiskey. And so both this distillery and the Yamazaki distillery were told to stop production for a couple of years during the Second World War, which obviously was super difficult. And luckily for Nikka, it was actually through Rita, because Rita, during this whole time, Taketsuru is trying to make money any way he can. She's teaching English and teaching piano to the children of wealthy families. So contributing quite heavily as well. And she was teaching the children of the head of the Japanese Navy, and know them. They became family friends. And she convinced this guy from the Navy that the reason the British Navy was so strong was because of the rum ration.
Right.
Kind of essentially implied that whiskey was the same as rum. So he decided that that he would just give his sailors a little tot of whiskey every day, and therefore the distillery to supply them, and therefore the need for this distillery to get barley from the Japanese government was essential. And so they had to keep producing through the Second World War. When Yamazaki didn't, it had to stop. And so that was quite an interesting bit of history. It was also difficult for Rita because she was sort of seen as an enemy person, like how we treated anyone from Germany or if from Japan that was living here. We'd have sent them off to camps or something. But she was put under house arrest. And actually the people of that town loved her because she'd been teaching all their children and to know them. There's streets named after her and stuff in that town. So the local people decided that she didn't need to go to a camp. She could just be under house arrest. But of course, no letters home at that stage or back. Really difficult time for everyone. But anyway, they did survive. And sorry, we are getting to the whiskey soon, guys. If you haven't been drinking so far, I apologize. But they decided that this is when Taketsuru was able to, after the war, was to make whatever type of whiskey he wanted to make. And what he really wanted to make was make blended whiskey. And it seems a bit weird now because we think of single malts as a kind of more aspirational luxury thing. Up until the kind of 1950s or 60s, blended whiskey was king. If you were wealthy, well-traveled, well-educated around the world, you drank blended whiskey because it had a brand name that you could ask for and sound cool in a bar. And it also tasted the same no matter where you went. Whereas obviously single malt was made in batches, small batches, and it had a bit more of a kick to it. And it tasted different every batch sometimes as well. So, and usually not really kind of good brand names, just named after the nearest valley or river or whatever. So so that was swapped around in the 1950s and 60s in Britain. But Taketsuru, when he'd been in Scotland, was before that. So he'd learned about blends, about blending, the art of blending, had really appealed to his sort of Japanese sensibilities of balance and harmony and things like that. So so he wanted to blend, which is a bit difficult when you've built yourself one distillery. And Scotland that owns one distillery could make a blend. In those days, obviously still nowadays, people trade quite a lot. So he could have bought some stock off of Yamazaki and blended with them. But obviously him and Shinjiro Tori were not really friends because he'd left to set up a rival company. So that wasn't going to happen. So Taketsuru started varying everything in his production process to try and get different flavors just from his one distillery. So I'll go into this in a bit more detail later because I'm trying to get us to the whiskey. The first whiskey. So I think, what's the next slide? Let's see where we're going now. Oh yeah, so there's some, that's what I just told you. So you're fine. The main thing I forgot to say actually is that their company is called Dai Nippon Kaju Kabushiki, which roughly translates to the Great Japanese Juice Company. And it wasn't until the 1950s when whiskey overtook juice. They actually made a really successful juice company by accident. And so they'd set up in the 1930s. And in the 1950s, whiskey started overselling their juice. And so that's when they changed the name to Nikka, and they took the Ni and the K's and the Ka from that earlier name so that they could make the name Nikka. So it doesn't mean anything in Japanese, FYI. Right. So, oh yes. Okay. Yes. So skip a couple.
Skip through forward.
Yeah. So what Taketsuru, like I say, was trying to make was blended whiskey. And what you need, apart from a lot of different single malts, he'd made lots and lots of different styles of single malts at his one distillery so that he could blend them together, is something else called grain whiskey. And that's going to be the first thing we taste. If you have held off the 1,000 hours since we started, we're going to start tasting. Yeah, I've got some. Hold on. Which is this one. So it's Nikka coffee grain. And this is, thank you, the grain whiskey from Nikka. And he needed this to make blends. So obviously when you're making a blend, you blend lots of different styles of single malt together with some grain whiskey. And he'd learned about this obviously at Bowness Distillery. And in the 1960s, Taketsuru shipped over a couple of stills. And they were of a very specific style. They're called coffee stills, which the word coffee is on this label. Nothing to do with coffee, the bean, or the drink. So yes, very important. It's got Y on the end, which is the Irish surname, rather than
a lot of people that when we show them this, they're like, "Oh, coffee," and like we've got the Nikka coffee grain on malt. And like, okay, so does it taste of coffee? And it's like, no, it's got. It's quite. I suppose it's quite confusing in that sense, but yeah, it has nothing to do with actual coffee.
Really confusing, and I think that sort of must show how important Nikka showcasing that they have the still. This is such an unusual still that they have taken the risk of everyone misunderstanding this word.
Yeah.
Because it's so important. So I think that's the thing that you've got to remember. Although also in Japanese or French or something, it's cafe, so it's slightly easier to not pick up. But it's funny because I think also there's a lot of suggestion in tasting notes. And so if you hear the word coffee a lot when you're tasting something,
yes,
you start thinking of the flavor of coffee. So many people say to me, "Oh yes, I can taste the coffee," and I'm like,
there's nothing in it. Yeah,
taste there. So that diagram on the left of this slide is a coffee still. It is it's a different way of making whiskey. It was kind of seen as more modern. It was a kind of created in the 1830s. A guy called Mr. Coffee or Aeneas Coffee from Ireland had patented this design, although apparently he stole the design off someone else in Germany, I think. But he had patented this way of distilling, and obviously I'm sure you know that pot distilling is quite labor intensive, it's quite expensive, it's quite slow, and it gives you quite a big punchy flavor, whereas this way of distilling is quicker, it's cheaper, it's easier, and it gives you a lighter flavor. So if you want something a bit sweeter, it's perfect for that. So this is what kind of brought about blended whiskies being a thing, and obviously then they were super fashionable because grain whiskey was a new thing, and so doing this was all new, it was cool, and that's why blended whiskies were huge. So this one is made predominantly from corn. So quite a lot of grain whiskies will not use malted barley as their base grain, and that's because it's quite expensive. And grain whiskey is usually thought of, and sometimes it is the cheapest kind of lowest flavored thing in your blend. So that's kind of what happens with quite a lot of them. This one, and usually grain whiskies are quite often made just from a mix of grains as well, just like whatever's at the time, whereas this one is made from corn, 95% corn and 5% malted barley, and the malted barley is there for the enzymes, and the corn comes, there's a little bit grown in Japan but quite a lot from America. They ferment that, they distill it in this continuous still, and I think actually the next slide, sorry I can't type in, here we go. So pot stills, what you're used to seeing with single malt whiskey, are those spacious copper fellas on the right there. And a column still is on the left, and it looks much more industrial, and that's only a tiny section of it.
You just have to give me one moment. There's someone just come to the door.
How exciting!
I'll
just keep talking. Don't worry. So column stills are seen as like a bit more industrial, but they are quicker, are cheaper, and they make a lighter spirit. And so you won't probably have seen very many of those in real life, because even if a distillery does have them, and most single malt distilleries don't have them, they will hide them because they do look quite industrial. But if a single malt distillery has a super tall building, then sometimes it'll be that. So Taketsuru got these shipped over from Scotland in
sorry about that.
no worries. And he got them shipped over from Scotland and then installed so that he could make his own grain whiskey. So this one is, here we go, and that's the sort of panel that's on them. So shipped over from Glasgow, 1963. And this is a hideous diagram of how they work. Please not concern yourself with this. The main thing that's different from a pot still, if you are a bit of a geek, is that it's continuous. So you're constantly going to have your wash going in, so your fermented grain going in, and you're continuously getting your spirit coming out. Why it's cheaper and easier to operate. And it's kind of industrial rectification. So if you know anything about splitting up of oil that comes out of the sea, it's separating things by their boiling point using plates. So that is how they work. I think we should skip on from that slide immediately in case anyone is trying to go down a rabbit hole. And then this comes out of the still, and this is put into American oak casks. No new ones. They do have new ones in other sections of the distillery. But these will be mostly ex-bourbon, and then what the Japanese guys at Nikka call refill casks. It's a cask they have used already. whether it was originally new or whether it was originally ex-bourbon. It doesn't matter. Once they've used it once for Nikka, it's called a refill cask from then on. And then they also have ones that they call remade casks. That's a cask that they use a few times, and they take the top and the bottom off, replace that with new wood, but leave the staves as old. And this is in there as well. Okay, so from the oak, as the sort of slide says at the bottom left, the flavors you get like vanilla. You get quite a lot of coconuts on the palate and on the nose.
I was gonna say I get like banana on it.
Yeah, there is that. I think that's an American oak classic, and corn as well. That's the corn note coming through.
Yeah, Neil, one of the people watching Neil, he said it's very creamy, and I believe that.
Oh my god, have people spoken to us? I haven't even seen.
Yeah, it's just on the comments on there.
And I didn't answer you ages ago.
You can see it on
I'm
there.
going to look at that more now.
But yeah, does that comes from the corn? I'm right in thinking.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, so the texture, and so I think when you distill corn, and it's actually, once you pick it up once, you never forget it. But it's a real buttery texture. Think of buttered sweet corn. And we're not tasting its brother on the right, and actually it's a bit of a shame because that's where the texture comes in much easier. If you ever get the chance to taste the Nikka coffee malt next to the Nikka coffee grain, texture is super obvious because this one is super thick and creamy, all that buttery texture spreading across the split. And the one on the right, coffee malt, is made only from barley, and barley, because it's not corn, doesn't give you that texture, and it feels a little bit lighter, a little bit thinner. The texture of corn is much more useful if you're blind tasting something than the flavors. But like I say, buttered sweet corn is a good flavor. Popcorn. Then you've got citrus. So for me, it's kind of marmalade-y here because of the aging, and then tropical fruit. So the bananas, there's hints of pineapple, hints of other things like that as well. So lots of happening. I kind of joke about this whiskey actually because it's it's really easy to drink. It's really, really smooth. It tastes of butter, toast, marmalade, kind of perfect breakfast whiskey if you're ever having an emergency. Yeah, if you've ever got the type of emergency where you need a breakfast whiskey, then this is it. Do not go for something big and powerful and terrifying. It's not going to help you with your day. I mean, I'm not saying this would help you with your day either, but it's just a safer choice for your palate. Less likely to blow your head off. So a great place to start. And like I say, sorry for the lot of chat before we get to it. It's the only way that makes sense historically. We're in now, don't worry. The whiskies will keep coming. Oh yes, and there you go, you get the corn there. So like I say, it's 95% corn. And this is a key component to Nikka's blends. And actually the next thing we're going to taste in a second is a new-ish, it came out last year, blend from Nikka. And the predominant component of that blend is this that we've just tasted, which is why I'm doing it right after, because I think it really helps you pick out the other flavors. So yeah, the product on the right, just while you're tasting this, I don't want to move on to the next one straight away, is made from 100% malted barley. And it's super unusual because it's still technically a grain whiskey, because a single malt whiskey has to be made in pot stills. And because this has the word coffee on the label, that means it's not made in pot stills, so it can't be a single malt, which means it's a grain. So people get super confused by that. That one tastes of malted milk. Maltesers, milky coffee. And that one does taste coffee. And then we're into a whole different world of pain when people are like, no, I can definitely taste the coffee.
Usually when we've got obviously not in COVID times, we've got like loads of stuff tasted. We usually have both of these open to taste, and if people are ever looking for it, we do sort of give like little tasters side by side, and you can really taste the difference between the two and the different styles in them as well. And even when I'm sort of explaining the two, the way that I sort of describe the Nikka coffee malt is that it is, without it sounding stupid, it is more malty. It's like it sounds like a really odd thing to describe it as, because you're like, well, of course it's malty, it's a malt whiskey, but in terms of comparing the two, like when you actually taste them, you realize, oh yeah, no, I understand kind of what you mean by that it's just got that kind of more, I suppose, traditional or more recognizable flavor profile in that sense.
Absolutely spot on. Yeah, I think the funny thing is that a lot of people will come and do whiskey tastings as well, and and talk for ages about the barrels, maybe talk for quite a while about water, maybe talk for a wee bit about the stills, but they hardly ever talk about the flavors that barley brings to a whiskey. And I think because it's in, all single malt whiskies, they almost don't bother. Whereas tasting these two, it really, really helps, I think. Any flavors in the second one that you don't get in the first one, they've all come from the barley. And I think, me saying Maltesers, people are like, oh, that's why they're called that. And you're like, yeah.
Well, my boyfriend made some brownies last night and put Maltesers in it. And then today we put them in the fridge overnight. And he's like, it's a bit of an odd smell in the fridge. He's like, oh, it's the brownies. They smell really like malty. And I was like, well, they're Maltese. It's got Maltesers in it.
Yeah. Delicious.
Wait, Maltesers are made from malt. I was like, yes. Yes, they are. So yeah, I can understand. Sometimes people don't always make that connection with it, I suppose. But
no, I do my so yeah, it's a bit more savoury. And this one that we're tasting, I think, if people are trying to get into whiskey from other categories, so if you're coming from rum, I think this has a reminiscent of an aged rummy flavour, because of the American oak and those sort of tropical fruit notes.
Like Jamaican rum style.
Yeah, if you've got a mate who likes rum but you want to get them into whiskey, this is a great stepping stone. And also people who like bourbon as well, because obviously bourbon is corn plus American oak, and this is just a slightly gentler version of that, so that works really well too. And then the coffee malt on the right there, that's usually much more loved by people who already drink malt whiskey. So that's kind of an easy way of separating them out. But right, shall we move on to the next one?
Yes, let's move on to the next one. Should I move the slide along?
Yes, please, darling.
Lovely. This is the next one.
Yeah. Okay, so this one is here also. And so this is, like I say, the newest one of the Nikka range. And it is a blended whiskey, like I say, predominantly coffee grain, the one that we've just tasted. And it's, as a blend, super light, really floral, as you can see from the kind of label, the picture they've sent over here. It's, it's supposed to be bright. It looks quite unusual, I think, for a whiskey. And I mean, it's a bit of a sort of stealthy one, this one, just because I think a lot of people look at it and think it looks a bit beginners-ish. And also, if you taste it after maybe you're used to tasting single malts or you're used to tasting something big and powerful, it's maybe just a little bit difficult to sort of get the flavors. But this is why I taste it here straight after the coffee grain, because it's got so much flavor. And what it's got is actually both the single malts from Nikka, which we will taste a bit after. And I know I only said Taketsuru had built itself one distillery. That's as far as we've got in the history. But I will get to a second one in just a minute. And then also that coffee malt that we didn't taste that we just talked about with all those savoury malty flavours. So really rounded, quite a lot of character. And I think tasting it after really, really helps you pick out those extra flavours. So the thing that I've written there after coffee grain is lightly peated Miyagikyo. Now Miyagikyo is the distillery that we haven't talked about yet. We're going to talk about it next. And it was Taketsuru's second. He built it in 1969. And it's designed to be a bit like a sort of Speyside style distillery. So foresty, floral, fruity, herbaceous. And then sometimes they make a wee bit of peated stuff as well. So just adding that sort of foresty, smoky note to it, but really, really light. Then Yuichi is the one that I kind of showed you already, that coastal one on the island. Again, we'll taste that later. But it should be heavily peated, although this one in this blend is not heavily peated. But you've got that little bit of the kind of coastal, smoky, earthy note coming through from that. And then brings you the malt.
Yeah, you get it kind of on the end of it, like when you sort of smell it, it's got that really lovely fruitiness that comes through from it. But on the palate on the end, you get that slightly kind of fresher, a little bit earthy, kind of that like refreshing sort of sea saltiness that kind of clears the palate a little bit. And
I think like getting the complexity of a blend is quite hard. And so sometimes having tasted one component and then sort of layering it on top and sort of seeing all the things that they've added to it is a really, really nice thing to do. So obviously this can be sipped on its own. I'm sure everyone's noticing how smooth it is. It's 40%. The last one I forgot to say was 45%. The last one was sort of 12 years old average. This one is about 8 to 10 years old average. but it's 40% ABV, so this one's a wee bit lower. So while it's younger, because it's got more of that lower ABV in it as well, I think it's, you know, it's super smooth too. Even though it's got a bit more intensity of flavor, a bit more complexity of flavor, and layers of just summery, bright, you know, yellow. Like it just tastes like Easter. Yeah. You know what you want, an Easter egg instead of an Easter egg.
Yeah, no, it's really lovely. I would think this as well is a great kind of introduction into kind of like Japanese whiskey as well. We often get people that will come in and be like, oh, I'm interested in Japanese whiskey. I've not really had much before. And kind of price wise as well, looking at about £40. And I think it's a really great kind of introduction into it. It's really versatile.
Yeah. And that's the thing. So you can sip it neat if you're really into your whiskey. I think there is a lot to explore there. Although, like I say, if you're coming from a big, heavy single malt, then you might miss it. But then, you know, putting it over ice or into sort of a highball, so traditional way of drinking Japanese blended whiskey would be tall glass, lots of ice, double measure of whiskey and twice as much water. Or if that's still water for a mizuari, and if it's fizzy water, you call it a highball. But you can twist that a little bit. So I use coconut water quite often. Basically makes it good for you, which I can't say, I don't think legally. And I use ginger ale or apple juice is great, and links to the history of Nikka. So then it's very exciting.
Oh, I can imagine that being really nice with apple juice.
It's really good with apple juice, yeah. I actually use apple and elderflower juice because the floral notes come through beautifully with that as well. So it's quite a nice. So there's lots of things you can do with this one, and like you say, for people who are trying to get into whiskey, get into Japanese whiskey, you know, a lot of purists and people in Scotland would think, you know, we're to know about a company's history, you have to drink the single malt from them. That's not what Taketsuru ever intended on doing. Taketsuru's entire aim for his company and why he did, I mean, he built distillery after distillery and made type after type of whiskies so that he could make these incredible balanced blends. So that's really, you know, the thing to start with, really. Yeah,
because am I right in thinking that this replaced the Nikka blended that was around as well?
There was two that it replaced, actually. Yeah, so there's one called Nikka blended and Nikka all malt. And Nikka all malt was Migikyo and Yoichi single malts plus the coffee malts. So it was a blended whiskey that was 100% malted barley, which, you know, it was almost impossible to do anywhere else because no one else makes, well, not many other people, someone else, but not many other people make grain whiskey from malted barley. So made a blend from all of that. So I'm not sure if anyone's had delicious Loch Lomond grain whiskey. That's made entirely from malted barley too. So it's the other one, but most other grains are. And then the Nikka blended was coffee grain and much smaller proportions of the single malts as well. Younger as well, also. So this one kind of replaced both of those. And both of those looked a bit 80s, actually. I loved the all malt label. So I think the 80s looking thing.
I think we've still got one bottle of like the super old, what was it called? Super old brown.
That's still a thing, yeah.
And it's like a really thin neck and then quite a big bottom, but like the font on it's really, it is kind of retro.
Do you know those rosés that you get sometimes in restaurants? The Mateus rosé. It looks like. I love that.
Exactly which one you mean.
No, Nikka Super is still a thing, and that's actually one of the first. That was the first the blend that Taketsuru produced when Rita died, like sort of honor of her. And it's still of the range. So we're not tasting it. We don't often taste, actually. I think we should because it's delicious. We didn't want to do 3 blends. We'd have to have taken out a single malt. So another time.
Sam's added a comment saying it's a very delicate number, this one, and it's got a very. It might, as you say, if you've gone from having big, heavy single malts or quite big peaty stuff, it might not be necessarily the whiskey for you in that sense. But for people that are kind of, you know, looking to get into whiskey or they want something lighter, when I can compare it slightly to anyone that did the Macmira tasting that we did, and they had the Grand Tea on there, which is their green tea cask finished whiskey, and that's is similar in its style. That it's quite delicate and floral, and I kind of I think the Nikka Days is along those same lines as well. You know, it's got that lighter sort of fresher style.
It is the kind of the elegance, and I think it is that lightness of touch sometimes that almost defines the difference between Japanese whiskey and Scottish whiskey. A lot of people ask me, started this job, you know, what flavors am I looking out for if it's a Japanese whiskey compared to if it's a Scottish whiskey? And I'm like, well, Scotland makes all the possible flavors of whiskey. So does just the Nikka company makes hundreds of different flavors of whiskey. So there's no specific flavor you should be looking out for. But I think quite often with the Japanese, there's a very there's a precision. I'm not saying that's absent in Scottish whiskey, but some Scottish whiskies taste like, you know, the flavors just happened with kind of wild, natural kind of craziness going on. You sort of imagine in Japanese whiskey, like someone with a very long pair of tweezers, just precisely each flavor exactly in place.
Yeah, a bit like a pro chef does when they've got the tweezers out with the garnishes at the end. But because we, you know, obviously with in English market, a lot of people look at blended whiskey and kind of sort of shy away from it a little bit, thinking that it's of lesser quality. But one thing that I generally will say to people about Japanese whiskey is that there is a lot of stuff that's blended. So we'll come to one later on, which is, you know, a blend. But the one thing that's always, I think I always say, is that the Japanese, they have a very kind of precise and quite meticulous way of blending. So it's very sort of thought out. And as you say, it's not to say that the Scots don't think about it in the same way. But I think in terms of the UK market, people sort of assume that a Scottish blended whiskey is just sort of stuff chucked together. Whereas in Japan, it is as an art form. You kind of see it as an art form.
The art of blending happens in single malts as well. Single malts are not single malts, so they're all blended.
Yeah, of course, The
art of blending needs to be shouted about a lot more, and people used to be embarrassed to talk about it because it was seen as, oh, sorry, can you hear Hackney in the background? But so people used to, I think, sort of shy away from talking about it, using the word blended, because everyone thought it was a blended whiskey and therefore should be cheaper. And I think we're getting into a phase of being past that now. Like, you know, a lot of people, you know, personally as well, I love the big punchy intenseness of single malt, being able to sort of look into it's from one place. So this is the shape of the stills and this is how it's made. There's that river and all that kind of stuff. But then just because you're doing a blend, you don't lose all of that, but you're just adding it all together. You're layering on top of each other. I think the way that that's done, it can be done really, really badly, which also then means that anyone who's done it well is a huge to keep it consistent as well. That blows my mind. Like, you've released a blend and for 10 years, even though the whiskey's components have all changed, tasting the same, it's brain melting. Like, amazing.
I suppose you could kind of compare it as well with, like, in winemaking, there's, you know, certain regions. Say, for example, Châteauneuf-du-Pape, one of the, you know, most popular, most well-known regions, known for some really exceptional things. They can have up to 13 different grapes in there, and that is a blend. But then you get other ones which are like single plot vineyards of, you know, this one specific variety or things like that. And it doesn't, you know, they can both be really high in quality, but it's a difference.
Different days.
Yeah, you know, with one you're getting one sort of just concentrating on flavour from one particular place, or, you know, from one particular area, and then the other you're getting, like you say, in the layers of kind of flavours and different components, adding different elements into it as well. So yeah, blended whiskey is good. I think that's
absolutely. And I think there should be, you know, if you're into your whiskey, then, you know, having a favourite is lovely, but you don't want to drink that all the time. You've got different days. I think a hot summer's afternoon, you might not reach for your favourite if your favourite is delicious Ardbeg. You may think that's not suitable. Whereas this thing is great on a hot summer's afternoon, just getting the barbecue ready and then have a couple of highballs. Smashing.
Oh, that'd be great. Well,
yeah, I know, now we're like, where's summer gone?
The weather could come back now. I don't think I'm quite ready for autumn yet, but
I know. Bank holiday weekend this weekend as well. You know, you're like, come on, guys.
It's typical though, isn't it? Bank holiday weekend. It wouldn't be a proper August bank holiday weekend if it was sunny, would it?
It would not. And it's my birthday, so it's, I know, on Monday. Yeah, it's very rainy traditionally.
Yeah.
All right, we'll take the next slide, I think, my love. Sorry, I've stopped. Okay, so now we're going to go back into the history. Like I say, we sort of skipped out of it a little bit, went to something quite modern. And we're going to talk about Taketsu's second distillery. So I think we sort of skipped over this map quite early on. So up at the top there, you can just see a red dot with the words Yoichi next to it, sort of the top left of that island, or middle left of that island called Hokkaido. And then we've got an arrow coming from the second distillery that he built. And so, as it says, 1969, he started building that. Obviously, you know, at this stage, he'd already had whiskey from Yoichi. He'd released his first blends. And, you know, things were all going quite well. It had enough money to build a second distillery, which was a nice change. And this one was designed to be the one with all bells and whistles. He had enough money to build it. He didn't have to use string and bits of copper that he had lying around and, you know, like he did with the first one. So again, they chose a site for the water. They chose the first site in Yoichi for the water, and that was actually because the stream, the river Yoichi, has got peated bogs upstream. So that's what he was looking for. Here, Taketsu, and the story is either Taketsu or his son wandered around Japan for 2 years tasting rivers until they found one that reminded them of Scotland, and then that's how they chose the site. So just imagine, like, traveling around, being like people would be like, "There's a crazy person. Just come here to drink the river."
Yeah, that's quite a thought, really. Can't quite imagine someone doing that in the UK.
Well, and no thoughts for logistics. No thought, can I get my distillery equipment here, my barley in and my whiskey out? Is there any roads? No thought for that at all. It's in a valley in the Highlands in the middle of nowhere. And that dot is actually quite near the coast there. It is not be that near. It's further inland, about an hour and a half drive, but windy roads through lots and lots of hills, getting higher and higher and higher. So it's he did it just for the river. Apparently he had a flask of whiskey from his first distillery in his pocket, and he'd get a little scoop of water, taste it, and if it passed the first test, then he'd mix it with the whiskey and be the second test. So, and when you go and visit, actually, they we can show the next slide. Actually, I think it shows it right here. Does it show the river? Oh, no, that's the pond. The river's running around the back of that, so sort of where that text is on the top left, and that row of warehouses, that's the line of the river goes. There's actually where two rivers on the other side too. But they take you into the river, and they get, you know, shoes and socks off, wade into the river, and it's stony bottom, and it's lovely, and you get in there, and it's delightful. And then just as you get kind of calf, you know, mid calf, and it's a bit difficult to get out, they're like, "Ooh, watch out for bears," because there's loads of bears in the area apparently. Taketsuri go and find them. So this distillery, like I say, it's all bells and whistles. It was kind of all modern. He'd made some money. He knew what he was doing by then. He had backers as well by this stage, whereas the first distillery, not so much. So this was as modern as a distillery could be in 1969. So that tall building there, they actually moved the coffee stills there. They had them somewhere else first when they first in Scotland, but now they're there. And then started making malt here. So I didn't really mention for the first distillery, we sort of skipped past it, but what Taketsuru did at both of his single malt distilleries was, like I say, try and make as many different flavors of single malt as he could so that his blends could be more interesting. And like I said, that was just through necessity because he didn't have anywhere else to buy from. Obviously, he could have bought some malt from Scotland to try and put into his blend. That's just shipping madness. So he started just modifying one variable at a time when he's making a batch of single malt. So, for example, your barley, is it peaty or not? And he's got 4 different levels. I'm trying to find out where my hand is. 4 different levels of peat in the malted barley. So unpeated, lightly peated, which is around 5 ppm, medium peated, which is around 14, and then heavily peated, which is around 40 ppm. And so each batch would be a different ppm. And so therefore the whiskey would taste different at the end. Now, he wouldn't just vary that. He'd vary the fermentation time, the yeast strain, so 5 different yeast strains at each distillery, loads of different fermentation time, and then also the still shapes at each distillery as well. And then the cask types. So as I mentioned earlier, they ship over raw American oak that they make into new casks. Then they have then they have what they call the reused, the remade that I went into. And if they've used a cask a few times, what they'll do is they'll scrape off the inside and re-char it. And that's called a charred cask. And that's just the American oak ones. Then they'll also get Oloroso and Pedro Jimenez casks. And when I was there, I saw a Pedro Jimenez cask, an Oloroso cask being charred, which isn't on my list of options that they do. So whether they were just trying it because it was cool, or whether it's the thing that they do sometimes. So there's lots of different cask options, and actually out of this, changing one of those variables each time, Tackett Syrians are making 600 distinct single malts at UEG, the first distillery, and then he did the same here. So from building 2 distilleries, he ended up, and he's vastly overdid it. Like Scotland in those days only had a couple of hundred distilleries. To replicate the flavors that you got in Scotland, he has gone too far. He's very thorough, and I think he's enjoying himself, you know. So so he ends up with 600 types of Yoichi single malt and 600 types of Miyagikyo single malt. And we're going to taste this next one now. Grab from my shelf. So this is a Miyagikyo. Where my camera is. And it, as you can see from the name down on the screen, that's how you say it. Just as an FYI, in case you're ever stuck. One of the rivers is called the Miyagi River that this is based on, and Kyo means valley. Okay, and so if you're thinking of Scottish naming sort of standards, this whiskey, if it was in Scotland, would be called Glen Miyagi. Okay, because it's the valley of Miyagi, and so in Japan they put the Kyo at the end. So if you can't remember how to say it, just think of Karate Kid, Mr. Miyagi. So if you start off with Miyagi Kyo, then you'll fall into the right thing. If you try and say it any other way, then you end up lost in the middle of all the syllables. It's difficult to get yourself out again quite a few times at the beginning. So this is a single malt here. So obviously made from 100% malted barley. Now, Nikka, Japan does grow a wee bit of barley, not loads though. And so actually quite a lot of this barley is shipped in. Quite a lot of it from Scotland, also some from France or Scandinavia. Occasionally Australia, actually, if there's been obviously time of year because their seasons are upside down. So it'll just depend on what's happening. But then it is all malted here. And actually, and the peaty stuff is malted in Scotland. The peaty stuff only comes from Scotland, from the Scottish malt house. But they can malt the local stuff here. So, like I say, obviously there's different peat levels coming in, and then they'll do the rest of production here. So Miyagikyo is designed to be kind of slightly Speyside-ish in style. So really fruity, floral, quite honeyed. The valley is absolutely stunning and looks really like Scotland when you're there. I remember the first time I visited, I got out the bus and it looked even more like Scotland because it was raining so hard. You could see anything. And I was like, yep, feels like home. So, and those buildings, it looks like a lot of warehouses, but it's not, unfortunately. I mean, they are, all the ones on the left are all warehouses, but and as I'm sure you're all aware, is a bit of an earthquakey country, and what they can't take the risk of is there being a whiskey waterfall if a big shake happens. So those warehouses are essentially all really, really short. They're only 2 rows of whiskey. So base layer on the ground, so it's dunnage warehouses. So base layer on the ground and 1 extra cask stacked on top, and that's it. So you sort of walk into these warehouses, you have to duck down. It's like hobbit buildings. Really short, hardly any whiskey in them at all. Really devastating.
Now you've mentioned that, you can kind of tell from the perspective of the picture that they are actually really quite sort of
little stumpy buildings. So loads of warehouses. People used to be like, I've seen this picture, you're saying there's a shortage of Japanese whiskey, and there is not. Look at all these warehouses, imagining there maybe 3 or 4 stacks in there, like you'd get in Scotland, but no, unfortunately.
Well, I was going to say, usually when you see like stacks of kind of like barrels and things like that, they're kind of normally double the size of like a normal room, and full from sort of bottom to top with barrels in there. But they look like they're quite possibly smaller.
Really tiny. You have to duck to get in them, and then you can only really stand in that pointy bit at the top. You can't like go into the sides. It's a bit short. So yes, just in case anyone's like, there should be tons of it. It's not. So this Miyagikyo single malt, I'm not sure if anyone had any of this before, sort of 2015 there used to be a 10-year-old, a 12-year-old, and a 15-year-old, but they were all discontinued as part of the big shortages of 2015 to 2020. That's kind of still happening a little bit. We're getting out of it now. So both the Nikka and actually the Suntory distilleries went on to half production in the 80s because people in Japan, whiskey was so cool. Once it started being made, and everyone drank it in highballs with kind of lunch and dinner. And then they started drinking lager. And so people stopped drinking whiskey with lunch. Rude. And so whiskey sales kind of plummeted. And so in the 1980s, both Nikka and Suntory distilleries went on to sort of half production. So just running, alternate weeks or alternate months or, just half the year. And they went back on to full production about 8-9 years ago. But considering this is kind of 10 to 12 years old, that's sort of the problem. So that's why they discontinued all the older ones so they could smoosh them all together into one product.
So do you think, obviously now, because of the popularity of Japanese whiskey in kind of today's society as well, and with the sort of age statement stuff as well, you see obviously the prices have gone kind of sky high for certain bottles and things like that. And in the cabinet behind us, we've got all like the posh stuff, and we've got a Hatsuri, which is about 170 odd pounds. Do you think that because obviously now the production, sort of 9 years or so, we might start to see more age statement come through? Do you reckon that'll start to go back down again? And do you think it'll be a little bit more accessible again? Because I mean, things like Hibiki 12-year-old, it's something like £300 now. And
it's gone crazy.
It's one of those things that my dad likes Hibiki, but he says you wouldn't pay £300 for a 12-year-old Hibiki, because he said, I don't think it's necessarily worth the money. That's kind of
absolutely. I mean, it's like a dress, and you're like, oh, that's a nice dress, and you're like, £80. Okay, I'll get the dress. It's okay. And then you see the same dress, and you're like, £400.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
So I think there will be a bit more supply coming. I mean, Nikka distilleries last year went on to 24-hour production for the first time ever, but that's only last year. So they went on to full-time production, as in not half a year, 8-9 years ago, and then last year went on to 24-hour production. But I'm like, gosh, you could have done that 5 years ago. What have you been? It's a while to set up, unsurprisingly. So I think we will start to see a bit of an easing of the stocks. I still think there's a couple of years of it not sort of being churned out. Obviously, if you release all that stuff now that's 9 years old, then you don't have any older stuff for later.
Yeah, exactly.
You're going to want to be clever about managing that to make sure that you release part of it, and probably about the same amount as they've had before, to keep some stuff in the future, do a few more age statements and stuff. So hopefully that'll happen. But it's just been a difficult kind of 5 years, basically, for everyone. And the prices, what I quite like about what Nikka have done, if they did do a lot of discontinuations, but they tried to discontinue the more expensive things and keep the sort of more affordable ones at a good price. So Nikka from the barrel has gone up a tiny wee bit, like not even the amount that interest rates have gone up in the last 5 years. And the same with the coffee grain and the coffee malt, a couple of quid only, I think, on those as well. So the sort of standardy level ones, I think, have managed to sort of stay put, or disappear like completely, but not gone crazy price. The expensive ones were the ones that they sort of discontinued. So
I mean, we have
accessible.
Yeah, we have sort of seen that. And when people come in and ask for a Japanese whiskey, generally, if they say, "Oh, I've got about £40 to spend," there is actually quite a range that we can show them at that price point, which is really nice, because I think sometimes people think Japanese whiskey now is like a bit unattainable, because you see, in auctions, you see sort of certain things, and some of the stock is insanely expensive. But as we said before, a lot of Japanese whiskey, it kind of focuses on the art of blending as well. So it's not necessarily, don't think important's quite the right word, but I don't think it's a kind of necessity that it has an age statement, or it has that kind of like this is a particular age that you kind of get with Scottish whiskey.
I think people are getting a little bit less stuck in their ways about age statements and stuff as well, a little bit more flexible. And like I say, I think blends are coming back. People are liking lighter, more elegant things. booze has fashion like everything else does, and it moves very, very slowly, but that's fine. Like I said, blended whiskey used to be the coolest, then single malts came in, and now it's, grains have become a thing. Now people drink grains, obviously, not just Nikka coffee grain. There's like delicious Compass Box, and there's Hay Club, and lots of Teeling do a great one, and a few other things. So there's different things that happen, I think, in whiskey, and people's trends and palates change a wee bit. So it's just, I think, quite often, obviously, then people sniff a lack of supply about something bonkers.
Yeah.
So, and that's just human nature, I think, isn't it? So never going to stop that.
Yeah, we've just had a comment as well, and they said that it's great with a touch of water. That is something as well that I perhaps forgot to mention. If you do want to add a touch of water to some of them, especially to the ones that are slightly higher in alcohol, so things like this, which is at 45%, it can kind of really help. I know some people are like, no, don't put water in it, don't do that, but I'm quite a firm believer in that you should drink it how you most enjoy it. So
yeah, I think everyone's palate's different as well. So, depending what you're used to, what you've had for lunch, what day it is, your palate will be different too. So I think if you're ever finding a little bit of a spikiness, then that's the time to add some water. And if you're not, then just carry on. But water, I think adding water to things is like shining a white light at a prism. And then you get, the rainbow of colors kind of all spread out. And easier to pick out than they were when you just looked at the white light. So that's kind of
really good way of explaining it. I like that way of explaining it.
I gotta get a rainbow in somehow. I've what did I use? Karate Kid earlier. I've got to get all my favorite things into my tasting. So yeah, absolutely. And I think the complexity of this one, something that we didn't. It's okay, don't worry. I was trying to sort of get to that. I still keep dancing around is this could be and is not all 600 of those Miyagikas together, because it's a single malt, but it's still been blended to a few casks together. So it could have, and it does have unpeated, lightly peated, medium peated. It'll have the different yeast strains in here. It'll have the different fermentation times in here, and it'll have the different cask types in here. And I think this is one of the things that you get again more likely in Japan than in Scotland. Your average Scottish distillery, your modern ones are actually doing it a bit more Japanese style, but your traditional Scottish distillery, I think I'm going to sneeze. Excuse me. Oh my goodness. It's probably an attractive face. So your average Scottish distillery, your traditional one would maybe have, one peat level in the malted barley, because that's what they always use. They maybe have their standard distilleries that they use. They always use that. And some of them might ferment for a couple of different times. They'll do a shorter one during the week and a longer one at the weekend. It's not on purpose to get different flavors like it is with these guys. They're just doing it because they don't want to come in on a Sunday morning and sort of change it. And then they'll use, standard thing is, American oak ex bourbon casks, and they'll occasionally use some sherry casks or maybe some port casks or, some other stuff. So they're not making as much variety. So what they put into then their single malts is again less variety. And of course, they've got different ages they can play with and different sections of the warehouse and all that kind of stuff. But here you've got loads and loads of options. And again, they've all been layered together. And I think you start seeing a little bit why quite a lot of Japanese single malts have been winning quite a few awards in the last 10 to 15 years, because of this just incredible complexity of water and of flavor. And that water is only going to enhance that and help it all bring it out. So but I think this picture, the green picture, this really tastes that kind of flavor, really foresty. This is predominantly, so I should tell you specifics. It's predominantly lower on the peat level. It's predominantly higher on the sherry cask level. So it's got all the cask types that I mentioned in it, but it does focus a little bit more on those sherry casks. So you can taste at the beginning with that honey, kind of raisiny note beginning.
I was going to say it's definitely got that slightly sweet, like honey, like mouth kind of coating.
Yeah, but it's not overly done. Like I think you wouldn't call it a sherry bomb. You wouldn't call it.
No, definitely.
So again, super balanced, and I think that's what they're aiming for with this. But it tastes like a spring day. Yeah,
it's really lovely. This one. Oh, lovely whiskey.
I love this one particularly because I'm a peaty girl. So I usually love the heavy smoky stuff. So when I was kind of getting to know Nikka, I was like, well, obviously Yoichi is going to be my thing, and just sort of expecting to love that one the most. And so then when I taste this one, still now I'm always like, oh my God, it's amazing. So yeah, beautiful.
So it's really fresh. It's like a kind of heavier. It's kind of a really nice mix of the two that we've had first. So the grain and the Nikka days. It kind of, for me, kind of marries those two together. Those kind of flavors and things.
So it's another component of the Nikka days, the second most important one in there. So but I think hopefully people will be able to pick that out. Going back to Nikka days now is hard, but because it will taste lighter. At least you maybe see where the flavors that were in Nikka days have come from. So the next slide, and I'm just going to say it to you. And this is a little thing about distillation. I don't know if I've got any still geeks on. Apologies if not. But the shape of your still will have a big impact on the flavor and the texture of your spirit. And so Miyagiki on the right there, the still is taller, as you can kind of see from my slightly hashed up diagram. And it's got a kind of bubble in the neck and then an ascending line arm. And that means that the flavor is going to be much more elegant and complex. And what's happening during distillation is your vapor's rising up that still. It's got quite a long journey to get to. It gets caught up in that bubbly bit and maybe recondenses, or it gets halfway up the line arm, gets a bit cold, recondenses and falls back down into the still. And that's actually where sometimes some kind of some of your bigger, heavier compounds get split into smaller, more elegant aromatic molecules. So you'll end up with a more aromatic whiskey from stills that are shaped with what I'm going to call more obstacles in it. So it's harder for those big, heavy, viscous flavors to travel across the still. And then Yoichi, the one we're going to taste next, and this is why I'm showing it now, because we're going to compare them directly on our palates, has the opposite. So a short still, really dumpy, onion shaped, so just a nice funnel upwards, so no obstacles there. And then as you can see, the line arm descends, so as soon as it passes the bend in the neck, if the vapor recondenses there, which it can do, it will fall forwards into what we're drinking. And so all these heavy, viscous, big molecules that take a long time to boil will make it through into what we're drinking, whereas they won't in Miyagiki. And so you get a very, very different flavor profile and texture profile, actually. I think texture is easier to pick up than flavor sometimes.
No, I
so we can go to the next slide. Unless anyone's got any questions on that. I mean, ask questions about anything, really. Yes, here's some actual pictures of the stills. Not quite as good as some of the other ones because we took them, but you can see the Miyagiki ones, and they're massive. On a big platform. So when you go and visit the distillery, you're down on the left, and we had to like lift up people to try to get them a bit higher so that they could get that shot. And then you've got Yoichi right there, and you can see obviously the
we can see the kind of difference in the sort of shapes and things as well of it. And
it makes a big difference. And actually, it's something that Taketsuru was really, really keen on, and I'm not sure if everyone knows that at Hakushu, Suntory's other distillery that Taketsuru didn't build, but they have loads of different still shapes there. And again, even though Taketsuru didn't directly build that one, they learned a lot of the knowledge and the ideas about how to make different flavors of things from that. The other thing that I love about these is you see wrapped around each neck is a bit of rope and then some paper. Blessed. And so this is sort of a symbol for steam, and kind of not a steam god, but there's a kind of definitely a spiritual aspect in getting the stills blessed and having this bit of paper representing steam tied onto them every year, which is quite nice, just to make sure they don't explode, I guess.
That they're doing the job properly.
Exactly. Well, you want them to keep the steam inside. You don't want the steam.
Of course. You don't want steam escaping.
No.
Especially when you're in a distillery, it can be quite volatile, I think.
Be delicious, but
just
condense it on the roof probably, so you just covered. Right, so we're going to taste the next one now if everyone's ready. And this is the Yoichi single malt. So I know historically I've already talked about this because it was the first distillery talked about, but palate wise it's much better to taste it now because it is that first distillery that Taketsuru built. So it's much more rustic, it's much heavier in peat. So again, obviously remember we've got all these different variables happening here. So generally a higher peat level than at Miyagiki. Generally a longer fermentation than at Miyagikyo. Still 5 different yeast strains, but different ones from at Miyagikyo, because you needed to know that. And then generally, and again, all cask options are used, but focus on American oak here. So less of the sherry cask, although there is some in here. Okay, and again, 10 to 12 years old, kind of here too. And so I think we can go into the next slide actually as well. Sorry, here we go. Nice picture. So we saw earlier kind of its location, how close it was to the sea. And of course, that's going to influence the flavor during aging. It does get that slightly salty coastal aroma. It's not full Isla because the weather coming in at the left of Japan is not quite as extreme as the weather happening at the left of Scotland. Just experienced 2 storms. I just travelled in Storm Ellen to Ireland and then in Storm Francis from Ireland in a storm. So yes, doesn't get so much of that. So a little bit gentler on the coastal, but it's definitely there. And then this is the distillery in the snow, and it is a bit colder. So this is the one at the north. And actually, Taketsuru, when looking to sort of set up his distilleries in a place similar to Scottish climate as he could, he nailed it. I mean, if you average out the temperature here across the year and in Aberdeen, it's exactly the same. Well, it's half a degree here. They do have warmer summers and colder winters, but the average across the year is the same. So did pretty well. And Miyagikyo is 1.5 degrees warmer, so it's a bit further south, but because it's up in the hills again, it's a bit cooler at the altitude. So really, really beautiful distillery. This is the one. It's kind of easier but harder to visit. It's further away from Tokyo, so it is a flight. But from the flight, it's then super easy to visit. Whereas Miyagikyo, you've got to get a bullet train, which is fun, for a couple of hours north of Tokyo, like 3 hours north of Tokyo, and then travel inland for an hour and a half on a bus or a car, or something. Whereas Yoichi you can do by public transport much easier. And this, I think it's because the original one, this is the one where, well, I mean, millions of viewers, obviously, of that TV program were there when I went the first time, because that was where it's all set. So very excited people.
Yeah, it looks a beautiful distillery.
Yeah, they all are. They're all. I mean, Japan just in general is just absolutely stunning, as is Scotland. So I think that's it's fitting, isn't it? Yes. Yes, if we go to the next one. So, yes, this is the other thing that we say about with Yoichi, because it was built so long ago. 1934, remember, they started it. They started distilling in 1936. And what Taketsuru built, which was not unusual when he was in Scotland, was stills that were heated up by coal furnaces. Totally normal. Everyone did it that way. That was fine. Then again, sort of 50s, 60s, 70s, people moved away in Scotland from using coal. When they built Miyagikyo, that was like all mod cons, that was steam heated stills. So, exciting. And now there are no distilleries in Scotland still using coal furnaces to heat theirs.
Really?
Yeah. So some that use direct fire, so they use oil, but not coal. So this is, and I'm sure there's other distilleries in other categories around the world. They're doing this, but this is the only one, and none in Scotland. So funnily enough, I think this is quite amusing. It's more traditional than any distillery in Scotland for how they heat their stills. Obviously, it's funny because it's in Japan. Dudes here in blue overalls, shoveling coal in all day, every day, heating up the stills. Of course, it's much harder. I mean, distilling is all about separating things out by their boiling point. And so controlling the temperature you're operating at is really important. I don't know if anyone who's listening has ever tried to turn down a coal fire or hit a specific temperature with it. It's pretty hard. The coal is going to differ. Different humidity. All the conditions are going to make different.
I suppose it's like when you have a coal barbecue and you have to wait for it to get to a certain temperature, and then once it's at that temperature, you can't really do anything other than cook your stuff on it. Obviously, if you put like something that's got a lot of fat in it, then that will obviously cool it down. But it's not when you've got, say, a gas barbecue that you can adjust the amount of fat that's coming through into it.
Great analogy there, Hannah. I hadn't thought about that one. I did a barbecue during lockdown. And the thing is, obviously, with coal fire, what you can do in a barbecue is move your shelf higher, move your stuff further away. You really can't raise up a still of juice.
Especially the size of those ones as well.
So it's pretty hard. And they actually let me have a go at shoving in the coal when I was there the first time. It was really fun. I mean, it was like quite a long time. Once I got going, they just sort of disappeared, and I was like, I'll just keep shoveling then. I don't know. But I was so delighted just to get the shovel full of coal through the door that I didn't actually think about where I was putting it, and I was just throwing it like straight in the. It wasn't going very far at all. And then when the guy came back later, he was like, "Oh, you've kind of made a bit of a hot spot here. The bit at the back is now cooler because there's no coal there. It's all burned away." I kind of made a very special. It made a very special distillate that day. So there's a lot of skill. They have to train for 3 years before they're allowed to sort of be in charge of this. And it's satisfying to go and visit, actually, because everything is, copper levers or metal levers and shoveling coal, and it's really, really visual and traditional and rustic. I used that word earlier, and it really makes sense. So I think sometimes you go and visit modern distilleries, and the dudes in charge are in a different room pressing buttons on a very old computer quite often, and that's how they're running everything.
You always look very like prim, proper, and clean. I think you see it quite a bit with gin distilleries, and I know there's a lot that are doing kind of like gin schools and things like that, which are really great. But there's some gin distilleries. I mean, not that it's a bad thing. Like Manchester Gin, for example, they're underneath the old railway arches, and they've made it like their still is part of their kind of tasting room, and where you can make your own gin and stuff, and you can see it from the bar, and it's very much part of it that you can see it, but it looks all very clean and very like pristine. And then you get places like Tarquin's Gin that making them in kind of big sort of pot stills that are still using dough around the top of it to sort of stop any escaping from it. So it's quite different, the kind of two styles you get. Some people like that very kind of like pristine look, and it's like, this is our wonderful still, and other people like it's kind of have that kind of rustic charm. And you can see with this, with the actually it's definitely got that kind of rustic sort of
I mean, I can't think of anything else that was built in 1934. You know what I mean? I think that would all look pretty. I mean, it's obviously absolutely pristine and perfectly clean because everything's very, very clean all the time. But yeah, obviously coal dust everywhere. And just amazing old stills. Taketsuru, actually, when he first started out, he could only afford one still. Obviously, usually for single malt, they work in pairs. So what he was having to do was put stuff in the first still, run it through, then rinse out and scrub out the still, and then put that stuff that he's just made back in the still, run that through, and that's what he then put in the cask. So tons of effort. Obviously, after a few years, he was able to buy a few more stills and pair them up. But initially, so little money. They were the most expensive bit. But just amazing to see. And I think obviously it is a lost thing that Scotland doesn't have anymore. And I can see it's obviously not great for the environment, and it's efficient and imprecise. But that's also what makes whiskey amazing and different. Like, if every whiskey was made the same way, and quite often things, particularly from the 60s, 70s, 80s, distilleries have been focusing on yield more than flavor. And there's a lot of talk about the homogenization of whiskey and all that kind of stuff that's happened. Everyone's the same yeast strain and the same this and that, and the same barley. So I think it's really amazing to still have this and still be able to see this. And I mean, I've heard that some distilleries in Scotland, there's a couple of distilleries that people are talking about building, that they say they're going to put in coal-fired stills. I'm not sure they're going to continue with that once they get going. They'll be like, wow, this is hard. And
it's a lot of work.
So we needed overalls. So, it might not actually happen, but I just think it's nice as a piece of heritage. And the thing with Japan as well, obviously this whiskey was new to them at the time, but now this is history to them. And changing it now would be like implying that Taketsuru didn't build it in the correct way, which is unthinkable. So I'm glad we're still doing it.
It's a nice sort of thing, I suppose, in the sense of history, to be able to still sort of see it like that. And as you say, there isn't places in Scotland that are still doing it in this traditional manner, but this is kind of an ode to how whiskey would have been made, at the beginning of the 19th century. And as you say, if you to just sort of take it out and replace it with something new, yes, it would be more energy efficient, But I think there still needs to be some kind of nod to the fact that this is the historic kind of method.
And it does change the flavor as well, actually. Like, people quite often ask what flavor does it give. It's a bit difficult to sort of describe. But the bottom of those stills end up being heated to about 700 to 1,000 degrees C, which is massively too much for what you need. So for wash stills, the wash is burnt on the bottom every time they distill. And the reason the guys are wearing overalls actually is not because of the shoveling, the coal shoveling, is because they have to leap into the still every time it's turned off and cooled down, obviously. And scrub them so hard because it is just such a thick layer of burned wash. And there's a thing called the Maillard reaction, which is when you burn kind of organic things, and in the bottom of stills, particularly heated like this and overheated like this, you get a lot of that, and that gives you the delicious flavor. So when, like, go back to the barbecue thing, when you char the outside of a steak, that's that same reaction that you're having, that extra delicious bit that you really, really like. And so you're getting that happening in the still here, which you don't get with steam heat because it's gentle. And you'll get it with direct fire. So it's using an oil fire. So there are a few distilleries in Scotland still doing that. But you get it more extreme here because you can turn down an oil fire as well. Whereas it's more hard.
The one thing that when I tasted this first that I kind of got is in the mid to the end palate, it tasted like smoky bacon, or like I was having something that had been on the barbecue. It had that kind of, and I think that's for me the type of sort of smokiness I like. I quite like that slightly sweeter, almost like juicy style of smoke that you get. And it definitely comes through in that. And I'm assuming that's probably down to the coal fire and like the burnt wash in there as well, that gives it that kind of extra dimension of almost like a sort of barbecue flavor.
It's a sweetness, absolutely. So you're getting the peatiness from the barley, but then it's converting that into that sweeter smoke rather than the ashy smoke, and that's what you're getting with that reaction, absolutely. And I think for me, and I'm not sure if anyone else was a student like me, but I went to uni with no knowledge of how to cook anything, and I regularly, you'd tip a can of beans in your pan, and you'd sit for a bit and you'd stand staring at it and nothing would happen, so you'd wander off just for a second. Toast, butter the toast, I don't know, all the essential things you do at the same time, and you'd, like, 2 seconds later, the instant you turned your back, they'd be burnt on. And obviously I didn't really have copper pans or anything, but the smell of burned pan bottom, which doesn't sound appealing, but was actually delicious, it's fine. There's a tiny little hint, and just like, it's a hint of it, it may be suggestion because I'm thinking about it because I know how hot these stills are, but I think it's again an extra sort of layer of flavor that you just can't get anywhere else. There's no other way of making that, so that's quite a cool thing. So yeah, delicious. And again, that's another, so we're sort of going down into the smaller components now of that Nikka days. So like we said at the beginning, the coastal, more earthy flavors. And again, the earthiness is coming partly from the coal-fired stills, but also the American oak age in here. And coastal style, we're talking about salt. Salt is a flavor enhancer. Salt brings out other flavors. So I think, again, and I forgot to say, has everyone noticed the difference in texture in this whiskey? It feels thicker, punchier, maybe stronger. And it's not, it's 45%, the same as the last one. But remember I showed you those diagrams of the stills? So those heavy, oily components that can shoot straight through these stills because of the shape, give you that flavor and texture. Whereas the Cure was lighter, it was elegant, it was more up in the air. This one's heavy, oily, and down here.
I feel like it's kind of heavier, especially on the finish. Like, you notice it more on the for me, I noticed it a lot more on the finish. It kind of like holds on a little bit more, if that makes sense. A little bit more grip.
No, absolutely. So I sort of joke that the Miyagi explodes up into the sky like fireworks. So you get millions of tiny flavors, and just as you think you're putting your finger on one to sort of name it, it disappears and morphs into something else. Whereas your Ichi, it points downwards, it soaks in through your gums, soaks in through your cheeks. And it's got about 6 big flavors. And obviously it's more than 6 really, but it just feels like the big flavors are all very obvious, they're very powerful, they're all just sort of milling around in like an oily puddle.
Yeah, no, it's really lovely. It's a different style of sort of smoky whiskey, I suppose, to what you would get from Islay. Obviously Islay has that kind of some of them can have that quite sort of delicate herbal style of smoke, and then you can also get that quite medicinal style of smoke as well, where, you know, you open a bottle of Ardbeg and you can smell it across the other side of the room. Where this, like, there's one or two whiskies that I know, Scottish whiskies that I know have that kind of more barbecue style or slightly sweeter style of smoke, but this definitely has that kind of, for me, it has like a richer sort of style of smoke, but it's balanced by kind of like the saltiness in there as well, which stops it from being just like quite sweet. You know, sometimes I think when you get like a sherried cask Islay, you get kind of like smoke and the sweetness and things, but this has got that kind of nice, quite nice balance on there. From it as well.
I think it used to be quite funny when I used to first start doing whiskey shows with these, because people would be like, oh, I just want to try one, I don't have time. And I'd be like, okay, cool. Well, you know, we've got a range here. There's a grain. You don't want that probably, and you probably don't want the blend either. We've got 2 single malts, and one is more fruity and floral, like a Speyside, and one is more smoky. Which one would you like? And they're like, oh, I want the smoky one.
Yeah.
But then you'd give it to them, they'd be like, they'd look at you like, you've given us the wrong one, love. This girl's an idiot. I don't know what you're doing. And because on the nose, it doesn't come across as that smoky.
No, it
tons of smoky on the palate. And obviously, people are like, what's the ppm on this? You're like, well, I can't tell you, because you measure ppm in barley. We've got 4 levels of ppm in the barley. Yeah. And I don't know which proportions they're in, because that changes every time to make sure it tastes the same. So it's not as easy to sort of describe as some of the Scottish distilleries, which like we always use 42 ppm.
Yeah, it's always this amount.
And so it is a bit more gentle. It is a bit more elegant. But I also, again, think if you've got someone who's, you know, who doesn't like, say they don't like smoky whiskey, but you do, this is a great one to sort of, again, ease them gently, because it's not aggressive. It's not shouting in your face. It's not trying to make your eyes bleed. It's really, really gentle.
Yeah.
Then it is a solid smoke in the middle.
I was going to say, when you first smell it, there's not a lot of peat on the nose. It's not one of those there where you're like, that is a peaty whiskey. I know that's got peat in it. It's almost quite deceptive in a way, because you smell it thinking it's going to be quite fresh and have quite, you know, sort of savoury, herbaceous notes in there. But then you taste it and then you get that sort of quite bold smoke coming through, but quite sweet at the same time. So yeah, quite deceptive whiskey actually. And like with Japanese whiskey, it's the layers in it that it's a really good example of how all the flavors are kind of layered in that one. So. And
they just don't want any aggressive flavors, and smoke can be quite aggressive. I think we've all smelled a whiskey before and thought, oh my goodness, like smell it from across the room if you just open it. And that's delicious, and we want that sometimes. I definitely want that quite often. But sometimes you don't, and if people you're making it for, or the people at the distillery, think that is too aggressive and they're used to elegant flavors, then that's what they're going to go for.
Yeah, definitely.
So this one, the other little thing I always forget to say about Yoichi is the stuff in the series. It wasn't this exact one, because again, Yoichi used to have 10-year-olds, 12, 15 and 20-year-old variants, and this no age statement replaced them, although it is 10 to 12 years old. The 10-year-old was the first Japanese whiskey to win best single malt in the world, and that was in 2001. So that's really when people in the whiskey industry, I think, definitely got it first, started sort of lifting their head up and being like, Japan makes good whiskey, because we've been made for a while, but people had always assumed it was hideous, and people are liking this. So you know, I think people were thinking, obviously, new distilleries, sometimes new countries trying to make things. I can see how they're going to take a little while to get into things again, like we said earlier. Making good whiskey doesn't just happen overnight, and there's a lot of stuff to sort of play around with to work until you get it right. But 2001 was really when people in the whiskey industry and the spirits industry started sort of noticing Japanese whiskey, and then more and more awards started coming in after that. So this is one best single malt in the world twice, but it was the first Japanese whiskey to do so. So it's pretty amazing. Well, not this exact, the one that's very similar. The one if thing you can find the 10-year-old, it's super hard to find auctions and stuff, but it's a touch more smoky than this, but not very much. Apart from that, it's really similar.
The one thing that I had a little bit left from the Miyagi. Miyagi. I had a little bit left from that one, and sort of smelling it side by side, suddenly that one smelled very nutty in comparison. it's quite interesting to sort of see how they both compare and how they kind of change in flavour. And obviously that is something that will happen that does happen with whiskies, and I know with Mira whiskies in particular, they're quite notable for the fact that you pour them and then they're constantly kind of changing and they evolve. Do you find that happens quite a lot with Japanese whiskey and things as well, that it does evolve quite differently as well, and you can get kind of...
Absolutely. And the stage your palate's at as well, like I've put these into this tasting order on purpose to sort of go up in intensity so that we get the best flavors from everything. Otherwise, you could be tasting something after something else and be like, taste of nothing. We don't want that to happen. So I think there's a lot that happens. And again, because again, this isn't 600 of the single malts made at UH combined together, but it is a good 100 150. So the complexity's there, the layers are there, and obviously just like a perfume, you're going to get the top notes come off first and then they disappear, or you get used to them and then you get the sort of the next notes down, the next notes down. So it's just going to constantly evolve, and it's just stunning. So this I love, big glass, big chair, and just sit and have a wee chat with it for like a good couple of hours.
I think that's one way. I mean, like we were talking about the Nikka Days being quite versatile and having it as like a highball, but there are some whiskies that you do just have to sort of sit and take the time to enjoy, I think.
I mean, it's like you meet a young person, you might want to go and have a couple of drinks with them, maybe have go to a club, go dancing. It's all quite fun, it's great, but then you sort of meet an old person with some great stories to tell, and you just want to sit down and just
listen to them and
properly chat. And I think that's what this one and the Miyagikyo as well. The Miyagikyo is amazing for that. So but that's again different whiskies for different occasions. So.
Lovely. So I think the Yochi's been quite popular. I know it's quite popular for us sales wise anyway. I thought, I had a feling that one would kind of
I usually joke it's a single malt that people can say, so that's one of the reasons I think it's popular as well. I was like, I like to try one of them. I can't pronounce that one, so I'll just stick with this one. So like I say, remember Mr. Miyagi if you get stuck. But Yoichi is a stunner. Like I say, it's one of Nikka's most well-known ones because it was their first distillery and all those awards and things. So and like tradition, I think you can really taste rustic sometimes uses, if someone describes a flat that you're going to buy as rustic, then are you maybe unsure, but I think in whiskey terms you're like, oh cool, this is I want to try that. Like
I think rustic in kind of like food terms and drink terms is always quite good, depending on like your palate and things, but there's certain wines that I definitely describe as being rustic, and I don't mean that in a negative way at all. I think it's rustic can in terms of drinks can definitely be a good thing. Definitely,
if someone says rustic restaurant, I'm in. But if someone says, and if someone says like, want to stay in this rustic cottage for the weekend, yes, but do you want to buy this rustic house? Is there electricity or Wi-Fi? Okay, everyone ready for the last one? I'm asking that question as if people are going to answer. So you have Nikka from the Barrel, which is a little oh god, where's the camera on this?
Which I think this is probably our most popular Japanese whiskey, I think.
It's the biggest selling Japanese whiskey in Europe. So your customers are very clever people and know what's happening. And this is the man who blends it. So this is Tadashi Tsukuma, or Tsukuma-san. He is the chief blender of Nikka. So obviously Taketsuru started everything up, and his passion was the art of blending. He passed away in the 1970s, and his son took over as master blender after that. He retired about 8 to 10 years ago and died about 5 years ago. And since then, Nikka have announced that they'll give no one the title of master blender ever again. The highest up in the company you can be is chief blender, which is currently Tadashi Tsukuma. So what they try and do is have a few different blenders, because it's quite a tiring job. You're not only managing all the blending team, but you're also traveling around doing talks and masterclasses and this and that. So so what they do is they share it for a few years. He does it for a few years, and then they'll swap to one of the other senior blenders, and he'll do it for a few years, and so on. And then the junior blenders are all working their way up to be senior blenders. So there's quite a big team of them. They do about 7 or 8 of them. And his job is obviously making sure the single malts taste the same and taste perfect every time, but also doing this kind of thing. And actually, this one was come up with by Taketsuru Jr., Taketsuru's son. So it was actually released, I used to say 35 years ago, but now I can't remember which year that was. Did I say that last year? 36 years, 37 years, a year, 30 odd, let's say, years ago. And the flavor profile hasn't changed at all. So obviously the components might have been adjusted a touch. But my favorite thing about it is the bottle, the label hasn't changed. And it's just so iconic. No, not at all.
Wow.
It's amazing. I mean, imagine seeing this 30 years ago. You'd be like, it's from space.
I was going to say, it's very modern considering I've got my boyfriend's a graphic designer, so anything branding wise, or we'll go out for a meal and he sits looking at the menu going, the kerning on the font's not right on that. So it's something that I always end up subconsciously taking in without even kind of realizing. But no, looking at that, you wouldn't say that is branding that is 30 to 40 years old.
And if you think of other blended whiskies, quite a lot of them look like the 80s, and all of them have been redesigned in the last 10 years, and they still look like the 80s, whereas this was actually designed in the 80s and looks the least 80s out of all of them.
Yeah.
Think of things like Chanel No. 5 and a few other bits and bobs, all of those iconic things from, so yeah, absolutely beautiful Japanese minimalist bottle, which I adore. And I keep them after I've finished with them. I make flavored olive oils and vinegars and things.
Ooh.
My kitchen's just full of them.
Yes.
I mean, I don't drink
them, I'm guilty of keeping empty bottles. There's a gin distillery called Forest Gin, which do these really gorgeous porcelain bottles, and I just can't get rid of them. And then my mum has a collection of mermaid gin bottles as well.
Nice. And my parents are doing the St Andrews one because they met and married in St Andrews, and is that Edenville? St Andrews, I think.
Yes. Yeah.
And so they're ceramic too. So that's right. So this was released, like I say, 30 odd years ago. It has changed, and it is 60% coffee grain, which we taste at the beginning, and then 40% malts. And the malts obviously are Miyagikyo and Yoichi. Those are the components. So it is it's all made in Japan. I think there's a lot of rumors because there is quite a lot of other new little brands coming out about this having other things in it. But the components are all coffee grain, Miyagikyo and Yoichi only. So it's aged for 10 years. And what they do is they age all the components separately. So the coffee grain's aged, Miyagikyo is aged at Miyagikyo and Yoichi is aged at Yoichi. Then once the barrels are judged to be ready, and it's not just obviously 10 years, some older in there as well, then they will bring them together and marry them. Then they put the married liquid back into casks, really well used American oak casks, so they don't got too much flavor, to marry for 6 to 9 months, which is a really long time for marrying. Actually, people do that, and then they bottle it straight from the casks. That's why it's called Nikka from the barrel, because they don't add water at that stage. They sometimes occasionally do need to add water, but they do that before they've married them, or as they marry them together, because they can tell what the ABV is going to be like after a little bit of marrying. So that's why it's bottled at 51.4%, guys. So sorry for taking who wasn't expecting it to be a little bit stronger than the previous one, because it is. But it's weird because I think it's stronger and lighter than the last one at the same time, because it's stronger in alcohol, but it's lighter in flavor because it's predominantly coffee grain and it's super smooth. Yeah. So it's a really interesting thing for your brain to try and work out, because some people's brains focus more on flavor, so they'll taste this whiskey as being lighter, and some people's brains focus more on alcohol, so they'll taste this whiskey as being stronger. And you're both right, but it's nice to try and find the other side of your brain and sort of see if you can spot the other bit as well, because both things are happening.
See, for me with this I always think it's got quite a bold, punchy nose, but on the palate it's still quite delicate, even though it has got the stronger alcohol content than the others that we've had. In terms of kind of flavor, when you compare it to the Oichu that we had, that's got that really quite big, bold, heavy flavors that kind of linger. This one it's got a nice balance between some of those heavier flavors, but they seem lighter, if that makes sense. They seem to kind of
completely right. And I think that's
slightly different.
Going on about stills types and still shapes for ages, and sorry I had to do that at the beginning, but that's why, because it makes a difference. It makes a huge difference, and that's the main thing that's happening here, is that this we just went from a full-bodied single malt to a blend which contains not only full-bodied single malt but also grain whiskey. And that's the plan. That's the point of blended whiskey, is to make your rich, powerful flavors there, but also soften them out. Just gently ease them. And that's kind of what the art of blending is all about. And it's a stunner, this one. Never, it's so cheeky because it's got all this amazing flavor, but it's super smooth. You kind of always have another couple of sips, and then it's quite. Then you're like, oh dear.
It's quite a dangerous whiskey to finish on, because it's one of those that I don't think you would. I know you're saying obviously some people's brain look at kind of the alcohol and think it's stronger, but for me it's one of those that I kind of taste, and you first taste it and think, okay, that is stronger, but the more you have, the kind of softer the alcohol becomes for me. And it's quite considering the strength, it's still an incredible sipping whiskey.
Yeah, worryingly drinkable, I always say.
Yeah.
It's like, because I think he looks kind of cheeky as well. He's only little. He's adorable shape.
Yeah.
And you can slip them in your pocket quite easily, not in the shop, obviously, but I like take it to weddings quite often and things like that. It's very nicely into a dress pocket or a bag. And like just worryingly easy to drink. And it's just that cheeky buddy that you're like, Tuesday night, do you want to come out for one drink? And you're like, oh, sure. Oh dear, am I going to end up? Yeah.
One drink leads to three.
Yeah, always. And this is him, exactly. So he's got a personality, this one. I love it.
Yeah.
Very, very cheeky. So yeah. And when you go to Miyagikyo and visit, you get to do kind of a blending session with Sukumu-san. So they'll give you all the components and the different things. That's kind of what they're showing in that picture there. And trying to put this together, even though the proportions, they'll tell you how to do it, and you do it, and it does not. You cannot get anywhere near. If you try and do it bang on, because of course the marrying period in cask, the control that they're doing, the layers, it's just a lot more complex than you think.
See, I didn't realize this has had as much time in cask as it had. Because obviously, Nikka from the barrel, and it doesn't have an age statement, and it's a blended whiskey. So I think because it doesn't have that on there, you seem to forget slightly about the kind of aging process and how long it's had. But 6 to 9 months for it to marry is, like you said, a long time in terms of spirits kind of marrying, even in kind of like winemaking and things like that as well. It's quite a long time for it to sort of just sit and mellow out.
Well, it's an expensive thing to do as well. With making blended whiskies, like we've sort of mentioned already, they're sometimes thought of as cheap, and sometimes they are cheap, and that's the plan. You want to get them out, you want to make them fast, and you also water them down, because the more water you add, the less tax you pay, the less alcohol's in the bottle. So these guys have done two things that make it, a bit more expensive. They've married it for bloody ages, and they've not added water, so you're paying more tax on it. But they do that because you'd lose flavor if you watered this down. And, it tastes amazing in highballs and mizuwaris and stuff like that. When you're watering it down yourself, see, the point of adding water, that's when flavor molecules are released.
Yeah.
So do you want those flavor molecules to be released in his face?
Yes.
The one adding the water? Or do you want them to be released in your face? And if I'm paying for flavor molecules, I want them in my face.
Yes. Yeah.
So I think that's kind of, I love a cask strength spirit basically because of that. Like I want to taste everything in there. And then if I choose to add water later, that's great. That's fine. I can do it. But I'll experience all the flavors that are released at that point. This one.
I think people sometimes can get a little bit kind of put off and think cask strength and think, oh, wow, that's really strong. Oh, it's going to be just like pure alcohol. But, it's often said alcohol is a carrier of flavor. And I did a private gin tasting last week for some clients, and we were talking at one point about Gordon's Gin. Obviously, it's a very historical company, and Gordon's Gin in the UK market is probably one of the most well-known brands. And even though it's not necessarily like the best gin, it is still quite it's well known. It's a consistent gin. But the one thing that one of the participants was saying is that they find that it's just not got the punchiness that they want, and that when you go abroad and you have Gordon's export strength is so much better than the Gordons we get in the UK. But that's because it's about kind of 40, something like 45, 47%,
Yeah,
where in the UK
absolutely.
it's 37.5-ish. And that difference in alcohol, even though yes, it's much stronger, and depending on how you kind of perceive it, some people kind of go, whoa, that's too much alcohol, can't do that. For some people, for other people, you get that extra strength really helps bring out more flavors and carries the flavors through that you might be missing in those weaker kind of in the weaker sort of spirits. So yeah. Definitely.
And I think the thing about cask strengths, sometimes they are pretty strong, but I mean the best thing to do when you're approaching a new one is take the tiniest sip known to man, and then you can assess what you need to do with it. And sometimes you'll be like, that's actually fine. I thought that was scarier than that. Or sometimes you're like, nope, I'm going to add a drizzle here or a couple of and that's fine. But at least you're still getting, if you're the one adding the water, the flavors are coming out on your face. And as Chris and Neil and Sam are all
I think there's some people that are like the kind of in your face flavors. I want
just like I want my money's worth. I want everything.
I want the flavor.
Exactly. But I was gonna I mean, I don't know if there's any other slides. I can't remember what they could be. I think it's just some one with the picture of the bottle on this. I think it's next, which isn't massive. There we go. It's one lot of awards. There you go. There wasn't anything after that, was there?
There's one more slide.
Is there?
That one. Classic
yes. So that's what I sort of mentioned earlier. So again, this is. It's actually not drunk that much in Japan. It's Europe's biggest selling Japanese whiskey, but in Japan, Nikka does make some cheaper blends, which, are much younger, definitely, and have a much, much lower malt content than this. But the kind of main way to drink blended whiskey in Japan is in a mizuwari or a highball, as I explained earlier. So there's a lot of kind of nonsense stuff on the internet about stir it 12 and a half times clockwise. And it really depends on your ice, actually, guys. That's the more important thing. If you go to a supermarket in Japan and buy a bag of ice, they're all giant, crystal clear, amazing ice cubes that bartenders would lose over. And so, stirring that amount of times is going to work with those huge ice cubes. But if you're using crappy little ones from home, then don't.
The ones that you put in
and just chuck it all in as fast as you can, basically. And the main thing to do at the end is that thing on the far right there in the diagram is lift the spoon at the end, because if you just stir it kind of horizontally, you're going to end up with a layer of soda or water at the top. So if you do the little lift the ice cubes, and they will. But see, that glass has got two giant ice cubes in it. We'd have to put probably 10, 15 in to get a full blend. So that's the difference. But it is delicious. And this, obviously, as we've sipped it neat, I think hopefully everyone's been fine. Maybe some people have added some water, and of course that's fine. It is stronger. Everyone will have noticed that but it could 100% deal with quite a lot of water, 2 to 1. It can deal with that as soda water, fizzy water, and that, rainbow analogy kind of comes out again, and it works really, really well. But also then bartenders love using it. So this, in an old fashioned or a Manhattan, or a Sazerac style drink is incredible as well. So there's lots and lots of uses for this one. And, that's why I think it's so successful. I think it was also super clever of Nikka making it this strength, because the reason a lot of single malt drinkers don't like a blend is because of the lack of punchiness. A lot of people at the whiskey shows will say to me, oh no, I don't like blended whiskies because they taste weak. They taste, they do. The grain is lighter and it's softer, and some things is less intense, but because this one's got the extra alcohol, it still has that kick to it. So I think it's one of the few blended whiskies that single malt snobs actually occasionally accept.
They're like, oh, okay. There's a nice comment from Sam where it said they've been good in they've all been good in their own way, which I always think is a good indication of kind of a distillery that makes good stuff across the range. There's if we ever do a gin tasting or tastings in general, there tends to be one or two that will be kind of the top sort of favorite. And even though I had a feeling you would probably be the favorite of people, it's nice to see that people you can taste through the range and taste kind of the differences between them all, and understand how they have kind of different needs, and they will suit different kind of markets or different type of palates and things like that as well. As opposed to it being kind of just, some, I suppose with some kind of, with some Scottish distilleries, with them obviously being location based and each location having much more of their own sort of personality and things like that, you get kind of, well, Islay is for people that like smoky whiskies, Speyside is the ones that like the soft ones, and things like that. So yeah, I think it's nice to see, just one distillery that does a whole range, but does it all so well as well. So not just, where it's like they've got one that they do really well, and then they've experimented with something else, and it's good, but not quite as good as the
I know. It makes my job a lot easier. There's no turkeys in here. They're all and I think it's quite nice as well. It's not often you get to taste the components to then taste the blend, and obviously. I know we did Nikka Days near the beginning. You've not tasted one of the components of them, but then to finish with this, having tasted everything that goes into it, is a really cool thing to do. And you Scotch blends quite often have so much in them, and they sometimes keep it secret. Weirdly, I don't understand that, and they hardly ever mention grain because no one wants to talk about it. Also, Zoe's sticking up for this one now. I think we might have a kind of debate on. But so I think it's just a great way to explain the flavors that get into things and the flavors that have come about and the reasons the flavors have come about. I mean, there is, the reasons things taste the way they do, I find super interesting. So we've got a coffee grain person now as well. Thanks, Paul. That's great.
It's really interesting how everyone kind of has their own sort of favorite as well, and how kind of you can see kind of the different sort of styles and things, how they kind of go across the board. And because usually it's quite easy to pick out one that'll be like, that's the favorite, that one. They're like, I love this one, love this. But it's interesting to see how kind of how broad the spectrum is with this.
And I think even if you have a favorite today, you can maybe be like, oh well, actually, but I can see how I wouldn't, I like that one now, but maybe on a warmer night or a certain other occasion, or I was out in a bar, I'd choose this one instead. So I think that's great. But I mean,
I think Steph is just frozen.
There's so many types of whiskey. It's absolutely amazing, isn't it? So are you frozen or?
There you go. I was going to say it froze for a second.
I don't know. Maybe we've talked for too long. That's YouTube or the platform, whatever it is, telling us. Is this your longest one? I'm sorry, I might have overtalked.
No. So to be fair, the rum one we did was about 2 hours, and that was just me and Mitch at the very beginning from Black Top.
But he's a talker. He is a talker as well, isn't he?
Yeah. There was so much to cover. It was quite a lengthy one. So
he's an excitable puppy, I think, isn't he?
Yeah.
Okay. So I think coffee grain actually might be winning on the old votes.
Yeah. There's a few.
Sure. We didn't. It's not officially a vote, guys. Don't worry. You have to all try and. We should maybe do a poll. Can you do polls? I don't know. Oh, good.
I don't know actually. I've never tried that.
Maybe someone at another time. But well, I mean, so we're at the end of the whiskies and we're at the end of the things. So obviously, if anyone has any questions, get typing. I'm sure me and Hannah can walk for another couple of seconds.
Which is your personal favorite then, Steph? Is it the?
It's difficult. I mean, it's difficult, and I love them all. And hopefully, you've been able to see that. I think them all as different members of my family, basically. And like I said, I've given them all personalities in my brain. I'd really love to actually speak to kind of an artist one day and sort of describe the personalities of the people that I think each one is, and have them sort of draw them.
That would be really cool. I was going to say, to be fair, I usually hate the question when people go, and I show them a range of something, they go, which is your favourite? And I'm like,
Do you notice I just didn't answer? So I think they all have amazing characteristics for different reasons, and depending what I'm doing and what I've had for lunch and all that kind of stuff.
I do think that is one thing where people are like, oh, so what's your go-to or what's your favourite? And there are some things that are like, that's my go-to. I'll always be happy to drink that. But there will always be things where I kind of skirt around it and say, it just depends on my mood, really, and what I'm doing.
It is difficult. Yeah. I mean, I think, obviously Nikka from the Barrel is such a great introduction to the company. It's the flagship. So people haven't had it before, then I always usually suggest they start with that. But then if they're coming from rum or bourbon, then the coffee grain. Then if they're into the space side, or they want to be a bit elegant. So there's all of them. And then Days has come out of nowhere because I was, launching a new one that's a blend. It's a bit younger, lower ABV. It's all the things that I'm usually, not that interested in. And it's blown me away, the quality of it.
Yeah.
So for that price, like, so cheap. How was that even? I think they all have their own place, and then Yoichi is, like I say, an old it's like my granddad.
So I know that there's one question I did want to ask. I know that the in between kind of in the range, the in between sort of the Nikka from the barrel and the coffee range, there's the pure malt range as well. Are you still they're still in production and still being made? There's the pure malt black and the pure malt red, isn't there?
Yes. Okay. So no, good question. So as a part of all these shortages, particularly of single malts, and the pure malt range is obviously, and people might not realize, but pure malt is a Japanese version of what we call blended malt. So it's malt from different distilleries, so Yoichi and Miyagikyo together, but no grain. So you've got blended whiskey, grain plus malts, and then you have blended malts, or as the Japanese call it, pure malt, which is just different single malts together. So they had a couple of ranges of those, which is all gone. So there used to be pure malt red and black and white. Now, you guys, do you still have some red and black?
We've still got red and black, yes.
That is amazing because they are discontinued. They were discontinued last year. And whatever is in the UK is all that there will be. And they are very good. And they're just wee bottles like this one, but they look like milk bottles. And the red one is predominantly, and I love them because what they are is they're not playing with different casks. So this one, Nikka, took away the options of different casks, but they focused on peat. And the pure malt red is peaty Miyagikyo with unpeated Yoichi. So unusual because Miyagikyo is usually less peated and Yoichi is usually more peated. So it's the wrong way around for both of them. Then together, 10 years old, just ex-bourbon and refill casks. And it's all about the smoke and the smokiness, the peaty flavors that come from Miyagikyo because of the shape of the stills and the forest taste much more foresty, piney, resinous than they do the other way around. And the pure malt black is the other way around. It's peaty Yoichi and unpeated Miyagikyo. So then it's more smoky actually, but really mellow and more kind of like, a bit more kind of ashy, bonfire kind of flavors. And so they're both 43% ABV, she says, not knowing actually that for sure.
I think they're around that.
I think they are 43 actually. No, I definitely know for sure now. And they are amazing, absolutely delicious. If you're really into your single malts, I love a blended malt because you pay 20 quid for the word single on your single malt, basically, because single malt is the cool thing to drink that people want to aspire to. So suddenly just chucking a couple together saves you a bunch of money. So if you want something to drink on a Monday or Tuesday or slightly early in the week and or buying something for someone, but you don't want to spend 70 quid on them or 60 quid on them, but 40 quid's okay, then you can get amazing flavored whiskey. And obviously it doesn't then have any grain in it. So it's not got any lightness. It is all power. And they're delicious. So those are discontinued, but you having them is great. So that means people can still get them. And being able to get a discontinued Japanese whiskey is pretty exciting for the collectors as well.
Well, probably if we mention it to Jeff now, I'm sure there'll be one or two squirreled away. It's always fun doing accounting. You kind of look at things and you're like, where has that come from?
Or where's it gone? So it's the importers. We're out of the black now. So you can't, whatever you have in black, you can't get any more from us, I'm afraid. But red, we've still got a wee bit of. So if you need to order more red, then you can. And the white was discontinued years ago. We've not had any of that for ages. We have a range of pure malts. It's called Taketsuru, so named after the founder. And last year and earlier this year, another vote for coffee grain we've got from Rachel. Good work. This year, the Taketsuru were discontinued as well. And this is such a shame because obviously they're named after the founder. I actually thought they'd never discontinue these because of that. And they kind of have, but they kind of haven't. So there used to be a Taketsuru no age statement, which was 10 to 12 years old. And there was a 17-year-old, a 21-year-old, and a 25-year-old. Those are all gone now. Again, we had tiny stocks of some of them. We've got some of the no age statement left. But what they are doing is like they did with the age statement in single malts. They're replacing all of those with one no age statement. So it will be probably an older age than the old no age statement, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
Because they're mixing the 17 and 21 stuff in there as well.
Wow.
And that is coming out probably October, November time.
Okay.
So it's a new liquid.
Okay.
They're running short of Miyagikyo, basically. It was Miyagikyo's 50th anniversary last year.
Yeah.
They did loads of promotion, which then
Let it all out, yeah. And of course they've got the short warehouses as well. So
yeah, well UH has the short warehouses too. So there's going to be a heavier proportion of Yoichi in there. So I think the age statement, like I say, is sort of going to remain around the 12-year-old area, plus or minus a bit. But the blend is different from the old Taketsuru. I've actually got a sample arriving on what day is it? Friday?
Thursday, so Friday tomorrow.
Friday tomorrow. I've got a sample arriving tomorrow of the new one. It'd be interesting. I'm going to compare it to the one that we have currently. So again, if you have, do you have any Taketsurus then?
Not on the shelf.
Yeah. Okay.
Whether we've got some hidden away, there could be some in the cellar, but off the top of my head, I don't know.
It's got the beautiful.
There's definitely not any on the shelf. I've not seen any for a while. So
you might be able to actually don't know the allocation. Sam might tell me off. Other Sam, not the Sam that's been commenting here. Might tell me off, but I'm not sure. I think we might have a little bit left, but I'm not sure because it might have been portioned out to our customers. But obviously give us a shout if you want to. If you're interested in getting some of the old one, but the new one will be out soon.
Because the Taketsuru was really good. I remember Sam is our kind of like point of contact for speciality in terms of ordering and things like that. So that's who we kind of generally will go to for we need an order. And he came a little while back. It would have been around Christmas time last year. We do sometimes like in-store tastings, or we did in-store tastings on a Saturday. But it's like a kind of barrel tasting where we'd have someone like Sam from speciality or someone from like a gin distillery, etc., with some open bottles and giving some samples out for free and things like that. And he had some Taketsuru on that. And I remember having some and thinking, this is
so delicious. Because it's predominantly Miyagikyo with just a wee bit of Yoichi in it. And for me, the Yoichi acts as seasoning. Yoichi, remember, it's oily, earthy, salty, smoky. And I'm sure everyone's cooked food before and then had that day where they forgot to add maybe herbs and spices or salt and pepper to their food. And then they were like, tasting it and went, oh, what's wrong with this? And then went, oh, okay, sorry, I forgot the salt. Chuck the salt in and suddenly everything is elevated. And that's exactly what's happening with the Taketsuru. It's absolutely stunning. And what that Yoichi's doing to the current one, just being a tiny little amount in with all that Miyagikyo, is just helping thicken it up as we taste from the texture, adding that bit of salt and smoke and earthiness that just almost anchors all those Miyagikyo flavors that were up in the air down a bit and just rounds it out. So it's a stunner, and it's way more than some of its parts as well. And again, because it's not a single malt, a bloody bargain. So I'm looking forward to the new one. It's going to be interesting. I mean, I really love the old one. I love the black label as well with the gold. It's not going to have that anymore, but that's okay. I'm excited about the new one.
It'd be nice to have that all kind of like the the new one in.
And there's also, so I'm not sure if anyone ever had the Nikka 12-year-old. That was discontinued last year as well. Again, and it's being replaced by something called Nikka Tailored, which is the same shaped bottle. But again, they've left themselves without any shape to give them a bit more freedom in blending. With the shortage of single malts. So that's also coming out probably October, November time, which I think could be quite interesting. Taste that. I think I tasted a sample of that last year. So I think it came out in Europe already, but we're getting a bit later. So a few little changes, it's little tweaks, like I say, making the range a little bit smaller so it's a bit easier for them to manage. Or like I say, removing an age statement just so that they don't get themselves in trouble. But hopefully things will start being re-released, or being age statemented again in a few years.
What I like is that they are kind of releasing, like, you know, replacing it. It's not just like, oh, it's not being, that's it, that's gone.
Yeah.
Like, it's, you know, there's something in place of it that will kind of embody that particular whiskey without it kind of being like, this has to be the 12-year-old and things like that. So
well, it's just a consolidation of the range, I think, as well, which is difficult. You know, it's been lovely. And Taketsu 17 and 21 had won best blended malt in the world. I think it was like 8 or 9 times in total. It was something ridiculous. And so to discontinue those, obviously, is pretty devastating. But if there's no stock, then there's nothing you can do about it.
If you've got the stock to make it, then
exactly. Like, I mean, Drew release like 6 bottles a year. It's not like no one can get one. So yeah, I think what they've done.
Yeah. Sounds like there's some exciting things to come out for pre-Christmas, which is always good as well. Because so we'll keep an eye out for them. And I'm sure we'll let everyone know when we've got new ones in. So I think I don't think there's been any more questions come through.
No, I think everyone's either a drunken heap now, or they've all just gone. Like,
but
I have to watch some telly. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you for coming on and speaking, Steph. It's been really, really great having you on. Some of the
Thank you for doing such an excellent job of hosting.
It's been quite easy for me, this one, I will be honest. Usually it's like I have to make a presentation and then it's sort of a few people be familiar with my face sitting and just chatting through stuff. So it's been quite nice to have the sort of conversation going, definitely, because it makes things flow a little bit better, and it's easier to kind of manage and make sure you've got everything in there. So it's been nice to have you on. And
thank you, my darling. Well, you made it much easier for me as well. My first ones, I don't think I swore once. I'm hoping not. Usually I'm
no, it all seems to have gone very smoothly. The very first virtual tasting we did with Mac Mira, Alex, who was hosting it, halfway through his computer just stopped working and had to turned itself off. So I was just sat there like, okay. But then it came back and that was fine. So we haven't had any glitches like that. And then we did the rum tasting. I came up here to the new shop to set up. Started to set it up. The internet wasn't working. Had to rush back down to the other shop. Made it with about 3 minutes to spare. So I
woke up this morning and my internet wasn't working, and I was like, oh my God. And then luckily set the router and everything was fine. Turned it off, turned it on again.
So
okay, but all right. Well, have a lovely evening, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us.
Happy birthday as well. Have a happy birthday on Monday. And enjoy. Hope everyone has a lovely weekend. And we'll see you in the next tasting, or see you soon, Steph. So thank you. Bye.